The fate of Britain had been lost in blood and mist since the Roman withdrawal. Celtic tribes, Saxon invaders, and petty kings fought tirelessly for the island's rich lands. In this fragmented and desperate land, a single, powerful force, High King Uther Pendragon, sought to unite. Uther had earned his power by the sword. He was a fierce, ambitious, and ruthless man in his desires. But he lacked an heir to unite his kingdom, and this lack shook its very foundations every day. The legend begins at a victory feast, when Uther's gaze fell upon Igraine, wife of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall. Igraine was a woman known not only for her beauty, but also for her noble bearing and fortitude. Beyond the admiration of a king, Uther's gaze carried the fire of a dangerous obsession. When Duke Gorlois realized his king's burning interest in his wife, he abandoned the feast to protect his honor and his wife, gathered his men, and retreated to his supposedly inaccessible fortress, Tintagel. This act was an act of open rebellion for Uther. Under the pretext of uniting the kingdom, Uther led his entire army against Cornwall. But his true aim was neither land nor loyalty. His aim was Igraine. Uther's armies laid siege to Gorlois's castles, but Tintagel, perched on a cliff jutting out into the sea, posed a challenge as a natural fortress. Days turned into weeks, the siege dragged on, and Uther's ambition turned to desperation. It was in this moment of desperation that the shadowy figure who would change the fate of Britain emerged. Merlin. He was not merely a wizard, but a seer who saw beyond time, a seer who held the ancient wisdom of the Druids. Amidst this bloody and pointless war, Merlin saw a potential far beyond Uther's obsession. He planned a justice born of injustice, an order born of chaos. Merlin, entering Uther's tent uninvited, knew the king's darkest desire. "I will give you, Igraine," he said, his voice like the calm before the storm. "Tonight, in the bed of Tintagel, you will be in the image of the Duke." Uther's eyes shone with wonder and hope, but Merlin had one condition. "However, the child born of this union," the wizard continued, "that child will be mine. His destiny will be forged in my hands. He will be neither yours nor Igraine's. He will be Britain's." Uther Pendragon swore this terrible oath, his desire overcoming his reason. That night, Merlin's most powerful spells worked. Mist and shadows enveloped Uther, transforming him from his voice to his walk into a perfect replica of Duke Gorlois. The castle guards opened the gates, believing their lord had broken through the siege. Igraine was relieved to see her husband return safe and sound. That night, in Tintagel's bedroom, amidst the storm and betrayal, Arthur's life began. But the irony of fate was cruel. Just as Uther was in Igraine's arms, the real Gorlois was killed in a desperate attempt to attack Uther's soldiers. In the morning, news of Uther's true identity and Gorlois's death reached Tintagel simultaneously. Igraine's world was shattered. She had lost her husband and been deceived by her greatest enemy. The war was over. Uther married Igraine shortly thereafter, but this marriage was never built on love. It was built on betrayal and regret. 9 months later, a son was born. Igraine could neither name nor hold him. Merlin had come to demand that his promise be kept. King Uther, writhing in pain, fulfilled his oath. Baby Arthur was taken from the castle the night of his birth. His identity, his royal bloodline, was entrusted to Sir Ector, a loyal knight unaware of all that was happening. Arthur would be raised alongside Ector's son Kay to live a life of common but honor, far from the luxuries of a prince. Arthur's identity was kept at utmost secret. He was not Uther's heir, but the seed of Merlin's prophecy, the future king Britain would one day need, a man whose character was forged with purity and justice.
Uther Pendragon's dying breath had once again brought Britain to the brink of darkness and anarchy. With the High King's death, the kingdom he had barely held together by blood and will threatened to be torn apart by greedy lords and ambitious commanders. The whisper that Uther had left no legitimate heir echoed like winter winds through the cold walls of the castles. Every powerful duke, every wealthy baron began to claim the throne as his own. Alliances were forged and swords sharpened. Britain was about to return once again to those dark days when brother fell against brother. At the center of this political storm, Merlin prepared for the next phase of his patiently woven plan. Before Uther's death, the wizard had extracted one final promise from him: the concealment of the child. Now, that child had grown up, raised as a young man by the side of Sir Ector, an honorable but humble knight, unaware of his lineage. Arthur squired for his half-brother, Sir Kay, practiced swordsmanship, tended the horses, and lived the dutiful life of a servant, not a king. Merlin knew that what Britain needed was not a warlord who would seize the throne by force, but a unifying symbol who would win the favor of the people and God. In the depths of winter, in the final days of the year, Merlin summoned his greatest magic. To avert a civil war, he invited the lords and knights to the great cathedral in Londinium to celebrate Christmas. This would be both a call for peace and a scene of divine trial. On the morning of Mass, a massive, mossy mass of marble, seemingly overnight, stood in the cathedral courtyard. Atop the stone stood an iron anvil, and impaled upon it was a shining sword, its hilt unjeweled but nobly forged. A prophecy etched in gold letters glittered on the stone surrounding the sword. Whoever draws this sword from this stone and anvil is the ruling, the legitimate king of all Britain. It was a miracle that instantly froze all ambitions in strife. News spread quickly. The strongest knights, the noblest dukes, all those who had any claim to the throne, gathered around the stone to test the sword. The first to try was the most arrogant and the strongest. He grasped the hilt with all his might and pulled until his veins swelled and his face turned purple. The sword didn't budge an inch. Throughout the day, hundreds of noble knights tried their luck. Some hung on, praying, others cursing, but the sword remained in place as if it were a piece of rock. It was a silent declaration that brute force, inheritance, or wealth were not enough to establish legitimacy. Meanwhile, a grand jousting tournament was taking place elsewhere in the city. Sir Kay, a newly knighted warrior, was eager to participate, and his squire, Arthur, was with him. Arriving at the battlefield, Kay angrily removed his helmet. He realized he had forgotten his sword at the inn. "Quick, Arthur," he commanded. "Go and fetch my sword. Don't let them start without me." Arthur rushed back to the inn to fulfill his master's request, but the doors were locked. Everyone had gone to watch the miracle or the tournament. Desperately wondering what to do, he remembered the strange crowd in the cathedral courtyard and the sword stuck in the stone. He had no thoughts of the prophecy or the throne, only his brother needed a sword. When he reached the courtyard, the nobles had dispersed in anger at his failure, leaving only a few curious spectators. Unnoticed, Arthur approached the stone. The hilt of the sword fit his palm as if it had been made for his hand. Without effort, as if the sword were sliding through hot butter, he pulled it from the stone and the anvil. The moment the sword was drawn, the sun broke through the clouds, and the light reflected off the steel illuminated the young man's face. Arthur felt not the weight of the weapon in his hand, but the silent whisper of fate bearing down upon him. As he brought the sword to Sir Kay's eyes widened in surprise. It wasn't the sword from the inn, but the famous sword from the courtyard. At that moment, a brief flash of ambition flashed within Kay, and he told his father that he had drawn the sword. But Sir Ector, a wise and honorable man, saw the lie in his son's eyes and led them both back to the stone. He demanded that he put the sword back. Arthur replaced the sword. Ector ordered Kay to pull. Kay pulled with all his might, but he couldn't. Ector tried, but he couldn't. "Now you pull," Ector said to Arthur, his voice trembling. Arthur drew the sword again with the simple movement. At that moment, Sir Ector and Sir Kay knelt before Arthur. "He is no longer my son," Ector said through tears. "You are my king." When the news spread, the lords were enraged. "A squire! How can Ector's unknown son be our king?" they shouted. But Merlin appeared, struck the ground with his staff, and silenced the crowd. "He is no son of Ector," he roared. "He is Arthur Pendragon, son of Uther Pendragon, blood of Igraine, and only rightful heir of Britain, and the sword has vindicated the blood." The sword had been drawn from the stone. The symbol of legitimacy had found its owner. The kingdom had begun.
Arthur was now a king, the weight of his blood and the sword he had drawn from the stone. But the title king did not magically buy the loyalty of a fractured realm. The barons who had hailed him as king in Londinium returned to their castles to become masters of their own interests. Arthur had proven his legitimacy when he unsheathed Excalibur, but now he had to transform that legitimacy into a power, a will that would reach every corner of Britain. He knew this would not be achieved through brute force, fear, or old-fashioned tyranny. What he needed was a bond stronger than the hierarchy of the ancient world, a brotherhood. The first court councils had demonstrated the urgency of this need. Even in Arthur's presence, lords and dukes squabbled over who would sit closest to the king, whose word was more valuable. Power was a matter of position. Position was a matter of standing to the king's right or left. This jealousy and arrogance were corrupting the kingdom from within. Arthur had to overthrow this old order. Inspiration came through Merlin's guidance, or perhaps a vision born of his own quest for justice. He should establish a council where rank, status, or wealth would be irrelevant. They should gather around a table where there would be neither beginning nor end. With this idea, a perfectly circular table, carved from the trunk of a single massive oak tree, was placed at the heart of Camelot. This was the Round Table. It was not merely a piece of furniture, it was the manifesto of a new era. All who sat at this table, including the king, were equal. No one could claim any right over another. No one was more important or less important than another. The knights gathered round this table would unite for the greatest ideals Britain had ever known. Their purpose was not to gain land or to enrich themselves. Their oath was based on a new understanding of chivalry. Justice, to pursue injustice wherever it occurs, never to allow the strong to oppress the weak. Loyalty, to be bound by an unwavering bond to each other and to the ideals they represent, especially King Arthur. Mercy, to show mercy to defeated enemies and to all who ask for help. To prioritize virtue over brute force. Protection, to protect women, orphans, the innocent, and the church from all threats. News of this new ideal spread faster than the wind. One by one, the knights who had filled the table began to retreat into the light of Camelot. The first to arrive were Arthur's most trusted men. His half-brother Sir Kay, despite his cynical and harsh temper, stood by Arthur with unwavering loyalty. He was the king's truest side, his bond from the past. His father, Sir Ector, and Sir Bedivere, one of the first to kneel to the king, took their places at the table, living embodiments of loyalty and honor. Then came Arthur's own kind. From the Orkney Islands came Sir Gawain, son of Arthur's half-sister Morgause, unknown to him at the time. Gawain was like the Celtic sun itself, brave, passionate, sometimes reckless, but always honorable. His power rose with the sunrise and culminated at noon. He represented the raw, untamed power of the table and the unwavering bond of family.
And then came the legend of legends. News of him had preceded him. From France, raised by the Lady of the Lake, a knight unparalleled in the art of war and courtly etiquette, Lancelot du Lac. When Lancelot arrived in Camelot, everyone held their breath. He was the embodiment of chivalry. With his mastery of the sword, his kindness, and his handsomeness, he was the living embodiment of Arthur's ideal. The moment Arthur first saw Lancelot, he felt he had found in him not only his greatest knight, but also his closest friend. With Lancelot's arrival, the Round Table had reached its pinnacle. He would become Arthur's right-hand man, the Queen's champion, and its brightest star. Along with them, Percival, innocence and purity, Galahad, Lancelot's son, the one who would find the Holy Grail, Tristan, the warrior of tragic love, and many others joined this brotherhood. Each represented a different virtue, a different talent. When the Round Table was established, Arthur laid his sword Excalibur upon it. The knights placed their hands on the hilt and swore their oaths. They were no longer just dukes, barons, or warriors. They were knights of the Round Table. The fate of Camelot and Britain rested on their shoulders. The golden age of kingship was about to begin with the power of this oath.
The founding of the Round Table was like a banner of justice thrust into the heart of Britain. Arthur Pendragon's vision was no longer just a dream, but a reality made flesh. The center of this reality was Camelot. The city rose like a miracle from chaos, driven by Merlin's ancient wisdom and Arthur's vision of justice. Camelot was not simply a fortress of high towers and thick walls. It was the capital of an idea, an ideal. Its walls were built not so much to keep out invaders as to keep out despair, injustice, and tyranny. Arthur's kingdom was founded on the principle that might is not right, but right must be strong. This was a revolutionary moral code, unlike anything Britain had ever heard before. The Golden Age began wherever this law resonated. The Knights of the Round Table, its enforcers, the swords of justice, spread throughout the kingdom. Their duty was not only to eliminate external threats, but also to halt internal decay. No longer could a cruel lord seize the peasants' crops by force, for he knew the shadow of Gawain's spear might fall there. Cruel giants or bandit bands could not cut the forest roads, for they risked facing the justice of Lancelot's sword. The light of justice reached even the darkest forests and the most remote villages. Every cry for help that came to Camelot echoed through the Round Table, and a knight would immediately set out to rectify the injustice. This sense of justice brought unprecedented prosperity. As wars diminished, people laid down their swords and took up their plows. Fields blossomed and trade routes became secure. Even Saxon merchants began to see that under Arthur's justice, trade was more profitable than plunder. Cities grew, and art flourished. Bards no longer wrote songs about bloody battles, but about the heroism and mercy of knights. Camelot's great halls echoed not with harsh battle cries, but with the sounds of harps and lyres. Arthur's court became not only a center of power, but also a hub of culture and civility. At the heart of this rise was Queen Guinevere. When Arthur married Leodegrans' daughter, it was not only a political alliance, but also the graceful union of kingship. Guinevere illuminated Camelot with her beauty, her intelligence, and her compassion. She was the civilized and graceful face of Arthur's warrior might. The queen's presence softened the knight's rough demeanor. The concept of courtliness became a chivalric virtue, as important as bravery. In this golden age, Camelot was a beacon of hope. Men from across Europe came to see this ideal kingdom, the Round Table, where even the king was equal to all. The kingdom experienced a rare period in history when justice, peace, and prosperity reigned simultaneously.
From peasant to noble, everyone trusted the king's justice. Arthur was a king who not only ruled, but also served. But this bright light inevitably fostered shadows. The rise of the ideal kingship unsettled the dark forces of the old order. In distant lands, jealous kings and queens saw this rise as a threat to their own authority. And even closer, within Camelot's own walls, beneath the brightest light, the darkest shadows, jealousy, forbidden love, and betrayal waited silently for the right time to blossom. The Golden Age had come so close to perfection that it now had only one direction left to go.
Camelot's idealistic light had not yet illuminated all of Britain. The sword drawn from the stone and the oath of the Round Table had ensured unity in and around Londinium. But in the rugged mountains of the north and the rebellious kingdoms of the west, the whisper of "Squire King" was still used as an insult. Many lords, accustomed to power since the death of Uther Pendragon and ruling their own lands with an iron fist, saw this young king's call for justice as a threat to their own authority. For them, justice was the law written by their own swords. Arthur's struggle to preserve his kingdom began, ironically, against his own people, the Celtic lords. 11 rebel kings, including King Lot of Orkney, formed an alliance and declared their rejection of Arthur's legitimacy. In their view, Arthur was a puppet not of Uther, but of Merlin. His noble blood was dubious and his understanding of governance dangerously idealistic. This alliance was not merely a political maneuver. It was an open declaration of war on Camelot. They gathered their armies and began marching south toward the heart of Arthur's kingdom, which he had yet to fully consolidate. For Arthur, the moment was to combine ideals with action. The Round Table convened for the first time as a true council of war. Sir Kay proposed strategies, while Sir Gawain, who, despite being the son of the rebel King Lot, had sworn fealty to Arthur, a bitter internal conflict for him, explained the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Lancelot, however, silently awaited his king's command. Rather than relying on Merlin's prophecies or magical aid, Arthur rose as a commander. His strategy, unlike his father Uther's, was not one of brutal conquest, but one of liberation and unification. The first major battle took place on the edge of Betrayal Forest. The army of 11 kings vastly outnumbered Arthur's forces. They attacked with all the might of the ancient world, undisciplined yet savage fury. But Arthur's army fought with a different force. They fought not for plunder, but for an ideal. They were fighting not for a lord, but for a brotherhood. Arthur stood at the forefront of the ranks, Excalibur shining like the sun in his hand. The sword's brilliance instilled supernatural courage in his soldiers. The battle was won by Arthur's genius. Unlike his opponents, he used his knights, especially the cavalry led by Lancelot and Gawain, not as a single overwhelming force, but as swift, flexible, and deadly units. He flanked the enemy line, divided their centers, and pitted their leaders against each other. Lancelot's skill on the battlefield was legendary. He single-handedly fought against 10 knights. Arthur, however, didn't just command like a king, he fought like the best knight. The victory was absolute. On the battlefield, Arthur defeated 11 kings, but he didn't execute them. This was the first and greatest test of his rule. He summoned the defeated kings to his tent. When he received their swords, he showed them mercy. He said, "I have not come to bring you to your knees," his voice weary but resolute. "I come to bid you rise. There is a place for you at the Round Table. Let us unite our strength not against each other, but against the true enemies of Britain." This act was far more powerful than his victory by sword.
while some kings, like King Lot, saw this generosity as a weakness and harbored grudges, most bowed in respect to the young king's wisdom and compassion. Immediately after this internal victory, the true threat presented itself: the Saxons. These pagan warriors, who had been raiding the island's eastern coast for years, had begun establishing permanent settlements and moving westward, taking advantage of the Celtic Civil War. Arthur's second struggle was against these ruthless and foreign invaders. Here was the famous Battle of Bedin Hill. This was not merely a struggle for territory, but a battle between two opposing worlds, the Christian Celts and the pagan Saxons. In this battle, Arthur emerged as a leader who united all the Celtic kingdoms. According to legend, on that day he bore the image of the Virgin Mary on his shield, and with the power of Excalibur mowed down the Saxon ranks. The victory was so decisive and devastating that the Saxon threat was eradicated from British lands for a generation. These two great victories, the suppression of the internal rebellion and the destruction of the external threat, made Arthur's name legendary. He was no longer simply the lucky youth who drew the sword from the stone. He was the hero of Badon, the High King Arthur, who united Britain. His fame reached beyond the seas, to Rome and France. He had preserved his kingdom, and now it seemed time to enjoy this hard-won peace.
Camelot's golden age rested on three pillars: King Arthur's justice and vision, the collective power and oath of the Round Table, and the grace, beauty, and civilization represented by Queen Guinevere. Arthur was the kingdom's brain and will. Knights were his sword and shield. Guinevere was its heart, representing the concrete ideal for which knights fought and bards composed songs. And the one who disrupted the perfect harmony of this trinity would be the one who was, in fact, the most perfect part of the system, Sir Lancelot du Lac. Lancelot was a legend from the moment he arrived in Britain. Not only was he the greatest warrior, but also the kindest, most generous, and most loyal knight. He was the living, breathing proof of Arthur's ideal. In him, Arthur found not only his best knight, but also his closest friend, a brother. Lancelot's devotion to Arthur was absolute and unquestionable. He was ready to die 100 times without hesitation for his king. But when Lancelot first appeared before Queen Guinevere, for the first time in his life, he was commanded not by his sword, but by his heart. Guinevere possessed all the dignity a queen should possess: intelligent, compassionate, and a soul that shared Arthur's idealism. When Lancelot looked upon the queen, he saw not only his lord's wife, but the goddess of the ideal of courtly courtesy he worshipped. He considered it his duty to be the queen's champion, to defend her honor in every tournament and every battle. The forbidden love didn't begin suddenly, like a storm. It blossomed slowly, like a seed. Arthur was preoccupied with the responsibilities of a king. He shouldered the fate of a nation. Wars, peace treaties, courts of justice, and the running of the kingdom consumed much of his time. He was an ideal king, but this idealism perhaps blinded him somewhat to the personal needs of a wife. Guinevere, at the height of Camelot, was an admired but fundamentally lonely figure. Lancelot filled this void. As the queen's champion, he had the right to spend more time with her than anyone else. They rode horses together, walked in the gardens, and discussed music and poetry. In Guinevere, Lancelot found a passionate and understanding soul that Arthur couldn't see behind his regal aloofness. In contrast to Arthur's unwavering virtue, Guinevere saw in Lancelot a flawed, passionate, and dangerously human man. In each other, they found an escape, a refuge from the perfectionist pressures of their respective positions. At first, it was that platonic game of admiration known as courtly love. Lancelot won tournaments carrying the queen's colors, dedicating these victories to her. Everyone applauded the knight's noble devotion to his queen, but they both knew that with every glance their gazes met, this admiration sank dangerously deeper. The conflict between heart and duty consumed Lancelot. He was betraying the two people he loved more than anything else in the world, his oath of loyalty to his King Arthur and his forbidden love for his Queen Guinevere. This inner conflict made him an even greater knight. To drown his guilt and sin, he embarked on more dangerous quests, shedding more blood for the kingdom. Arthur interpreted his friend's reckless heroism as an unwavering devotion to the kingdom, and he loved him even more. The moment of betrayal, that first touch, that fleeting kiss, struck the first crack in Camelot's golden age. It wasn't an earthquake that shook the walls. It was a silent poison seeping into the foundation, a poison that would, over time, crack even the strongest stone. The initial impact on the kingdom was invisible. The Round Table still met, the knights still went on quests, but at its heart, a lie now lay. The greatest knight held the greatest secret. This secret had tainted him. Later, when the quest for the Holy Grail began, it would be the answer to Lancelot's failure to achieve this most sacred of tasks, one that demanded purity. This tragic dance of love and betrayal hadn't yet led to disaster, but the kingdom's enemies, jealous knights and wizards lurking in the dark, were beginning to sense the crack. The perfect bond between Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, once Camelot's greatest strength, was now poised to become its greatest weakness.
While the bright towers of Camelot rose, and Arthur's justice brought a golden age to Britain, beyond the kingdom's borders, where the mists and ancient Celtic paths intersected, a forgotten grudge festered. This grudge was older than a kingdom, deeper than an oath. It was the grudge of Morgana Le Fay. She was not just a sorceress, but the dark twin of Arthur's destiny, the other heir to the throne, rejected and seeking vengeance. Morgana's hatred was born on the stormy cliffs of Tintagel on the same night as Arthur's birth. She was the daughter of Duc Gorlois and Igraine. Merlin's magic and Uther Pendragon's ambition had not only built a kingdom in her eyes, but also destroyed a family. Her father was murdered, her mother taken by force into Uther's bed, and from this treacherous union, Arthur, this false king whom Morgana considered her brother, was born. For Morgana, Arthur was not a symbol of unity, but living proof of her mother's rape and her father's murder. Every stroke Arthur pulled from the stone was a dagger driven into Morgana's heart. Morgana grew up far from Uther's court, sometimes under the strict discipline of a monastery, sometimes amidst the mists of the mythical Isle of Avalon. Wherever she was, her inner power awakened. While Merlin learned the magic of time and order, Morgana learned the forgotten, raw, and dangerous power of nature, chaos, and the ancient pagan gods. She didn't just cast spells, she could alter the very fabric of reality. She was a master of illusions, a sage of poisons and prophecies. Unlike Merlin, her magic wasn't to fulfill a prophecy, but to fuel vengeance. Arthur's kingdom was the antithesis of everything Morgana represented. Arthur represented the new order of Christianity, a single god and centralized authority. Morgana, however, was the last defender of the Celtic gods, the Druids, and the wild, untamable spirit of nature. Arthur's civilization at the Round Table was, for Morgana, a hypocritical veil drawn over the bloody but honest power of the old world. Her plans weren't to gather an army and storm the gates of Camelot. Morgana was a strategist. Her weapons weren't swords, but secrets and desires. Her plans, which threatened the kingdom, were as patient and deadly as a spider weaving its web. Her first goal was to find the cracks in the Round Table's shining armor, and she found the biggest crack hidden from view in the king's very bedchamber. The forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere was a blessing for Morgana. She hadn't initiated it, but she was the one who would turn it into a weapon. She sowed seeds of doubt with her magic, whispering them into the ears of the other jealous knights in the court, like Sir Agravain. Her goal wasn't to unleash this love at once, but to let it fester slowly, until she poisoned the entire kingdom. Her second plan was to target the source of Arthur's power himself, Excalibur. Legends tell how she used one of her lovers, Avalon, to steal the sword, tricking Arthur with a fake Excalibur and nearly killing him in a duel. It is even said that she stole Excalibur's scabbard, the magical scabbard that protected Arthur from injury, and threw it into a lake, leaving the king mortal and defenseless. But Morgana's darkest and far-reaching plan was to forge a weapon Arthur would forge himself, a betrayal of his own blood. She knew that only Arthur's own ideals could destroy him. It is said that she seduced Arthur using her magic, concealing her identity, sometimes disguised as her sister Morgause, and bore him, in a cruel irony of fate, a son. This child would carry both Arthur's blood and Morgana's hatred. This child was none other than Mordred, the one who would shatter all the oaths and ideals of the Round Table.
From the outside, Camelot was at the height of its power. The Saxons had been defeated, rebel lords brought to heel, and justice had reached the farthest corners of the kingdom. The Knights of the Round Table were renowned as the mightiest warriors on earth. But this worldly victory had created a void within itself. With no more giants to fight or castles to save, the knights' energy began to turn inward. Palace intrigues, meaningless tournament rivalries, and the quiet tension of the forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere created unrest beneath the glittering surface of the Golden Age. The kingdom was worldly satisfied, but spiritually starved. It was in the midst of this spiritual void, on the Feast of Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit, that the Round Table's most miraculous event occurred. All the knights had gathered in the great hall and were feasting with King Arthur. Suddenly, the doors of the hall were blown open by a strong wind, but not a single candle remained extinguished. Then a thunderous roar was heard, and a divine beam of light, brighter than the sun, yet not dazzling, descended into the center of the hall. The knights froze before they could even draw their swords. A bowl, draped in precious cloth, appeared floating in the air within the light. The bowl itself was invisible, but its presence filled the entire room. An indescribable, otherworldly fragrance of spices and flowers permeated the air. At that moment, each knight saw their favorite food and drink appear on the table. But more importantly, they felt a sense of absolute peace, purification, and divine satisfaction within their hearts that they had never experienced before. Each felt the grace of God touch them directly. Then, as silently as it had come, the bowl vanished, the beam of light faded, and the hall reverberated with the silence of the miracle it had left behind. The first to break the silence was Sir Gawain, always passionate and impetuous. He leapt to his feet, his eyes still ablaze with the shock of the miracle. "I swear to God, I will not rest until I see the veil lifted from this Holy Grail, which today offers us our favorite foods and its true face. I will ride a year and a day in this quest, and if I am worthy, I will attain its secret." Gawain's fiery vow sparked a fire within the other knights in the hall. Intoxicated by that divine moment, Lancelot, perhaps he felt the greatest need for redemption. Percival, Bors, and nearly every knight at the table rose one after another and swore the same oath. Each one dedicated to a goal greater than this worldly glory, the fulfillment of God's mystery. Only King Arthur remained, his face shadowed with sorrow. He saw in this miracle not a blessing,
but the beginning of an end. "Oh, my nephew Gawain," Arthur said, his voice trembling, "do you realize what you have done? Today you have dissolved the greatest brotherhood on earth, the Round Table." Arthur's fear was justified. The quest for the Holy Grail wasn't a quest fought by knights together. It was a personal pilgrimage, a test of spiritual purity rather than physical strength, that each knight must undertake alone. This was the mystery of the Grail. It was the relic that Joseph of Arimathea used at Jesus' Last Supper, said to have collected the blood from the cross. The goal of attaining it was not to gain worldly kingdoms, but to become worthy of God's kingdom. This quest would require the knights to confront their deepest sins, their pride, their lust, and their fears. Arthur knew that most of the knights who embarked on this quest would not return. He knew that even the greatest warriors, like Lancelot, would fail this test because of the stain of betrayal in their hearts. And worst of all, this quest would shatter the strength of Camelot, its very unity. But the vows had been made. The next morning, Camelot's courtyard was the scene of a somber farewell. One by one, the bravest knights, the kingdom's brightest stars, rode off in different directions. The Round Table was empty. The quest for the Holy Grail had begun, effectively marking the end of Camelot's golden age.
The silence of the quest for the Holy Grail had fallen over Camelot like a heavy veil. The empty chairs of the Round Table stood as monuments not to the kingdom's power, but to its spiritual emptiness. Without the laughter of the knights and the clatter of swords, the castle had fallen into an eerie stillness. In this melancholy silence, Arthur clung to a single solace: Merlin. The wizard had been his teacher, his father's mentor, and the kingdom's invisible shield. The knights might have gone, but Merlin remained ever present, as ancient and trustworthy as time itself. But lately, Arthur had noticed a crack in this pillar he trusted most. Merlin had changed. His penetrating gaze, bearing the wisdom of centuries, was now more often absent, his prophecies turning from the fate of the kingdom to melancholy whispers about his own personal fate. This half-human being, who could bend time and orchestrate the birth of kings, had, despite all his power, succumbed to the most human, most mortal weakness: love. His destiny was a young woman whom some bards called Nimue and others Vivian, a minister of the Lady of the Lake. She was a brilliant and dangerously beautiful student whom Merlin had encountered in the forest, with an insatiable curiosity for the ancient ways of magic. In her, Merlin saw an heir to whom he could pass on his legacy, his knowledge. But his desire to teach gradually gave way to admiration, and that admiration gave way to a reckless passion. For all his wisdom, Merlin knew this love would bring about his own demise. He could see the future. He saw his own imprisonment, his own silence, clearly. But this was fate's cruelest twist. The oracle could not change its own prophecy. Arthur had asked him repeatedly, "What is this absent-mindedness, O wise man? Is there a new shadow threatening my kingdom?" Merlin's answer was more cryptic and melancholy than ever. "The greatest threat sometimes comes not from the ignorance of what you love most, but from the willful weakness of the wisest. My time is running out, Arthur. The time for you to be alone with what you have learned from me is drawing near." Merlin taught Nimue his deepest secrets, words that summon stars, illusions that bend reality, and most importantly, binding spells that could seal a being forever. Nimue desired this power. Merlin only desired to be loved. The wizard could not or did not want to see that his pupil's ambition was stronger than his love. The end came as they walked through Broceliande, one of the most ancient forests in Britain. As they stopped to rest in the shade of a hawthorn tree, Nimue asked Merlin to teach her one last secret: how to imprison a person in a place where neither sleep nor death existed, where time had no place.
With the surrender of a weary man, Merlin gave his final secret. Nimue used the words she had learned without a moment's hesitation. She performed the ninefold binding spell Merlin had taught her on her teacher herself. Merlin did not resist. Perhaps this was a release from the weariness of centuries, the inevitable end of her own foresight. The spell sealed her within a crystal cavern, some say a tower of air. Merlin was no more, neither dead nor alive. He was simply trapped. He could see and hear the world, but he could never interfere. In Camelot, when Arthur awoke that morning, he felt a coldness he had never felt before. He knew his castle was as solid as ever, but something had shaken at its core. He called for Merlin. There was no answer. He went to the wizard's tower. The books were open, the potions had cooled, but there was no trace of Merlin's presence. Merlin's disappearance was the turning point in the legend. Until then, Arthur's kingdom had been built on an alliance of magic and the sword, fate and will. Merlin represented the kingdom's magical side, the bridge between the pagan old world and the new Christian order. With his departure, that bridge was broken. Magic began to withdraw from Britain. Arthur's solitude was now absolute and absolute. His knights, his physical strength, had been lost in the Grail quest. Now Merlin, his mind and wisdom, had been silenced forever. For the first time, Arthur was a truly lonely king on his throne. The stage was now set for Morgana's machinations, Lancelot's betrayal, and Mordred's rise. Arthur was now forced to face these storms only with his own mortal will.
Vulnerable in Merlin's absence and having lost its most loyal knights to the quest for the Holy Grail, Camelot opened its gates to a new visitor. To the outside, this visitor was a young, talented, and ambitious knight from the House of Orkney, but to the attentive eye, his features were eerily familiar. His dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and cold, penetrating gaze. He was like a dark mirror of the young Arthur. His name was Mordred. Mordred had not come simply to be a knight. He had come to collect a debt. He was Arthur's greatest secret, his greatest shame, his repressed sin. He had been born years earlier through the machinations of Morgana, or in some accounts Morgause, from an unknowing union with Arthur's own sister. This forbidden blood coursed through his veins like a curse. Mordred's hatred was not without cause. He had been raised on the nourishment of hatred. His childhood had been spent with his mother's whispers. "You are the rightful king, but he has rejected you. You are a mistake, he is a hero. While he sits on the throne, you rot in the shadows." He had also grown up with the story of the May Day Massacre, one of the darkest chapters of the legend. According to prophecy, a child born in May would destroy the kingdom, and Arthur, or his advisors, had packed all the noble children born that month onto a ship and left them to die. Mordred was the only child to survive this ship. He had grown up believing that his father had tried to kill him as a baby. So when he looked at Arthur, he saw not a father, but a murderer. When he arrived in Camelot, Arthur did not reject him. Perhaps out of remorse, or perhaps out of the pull of blood, he welcomed him into the Round Table. Mordred was clever. While he didn't swing his sword like Lancelot, his tongue was swifter than a snake. He was well aware of the flaws in Arthur's established system of justice. The vacant seats at the Round Table presented a field of opportunity for Mordred. He began to gather around him the young knights, disappointed by the Holy Grail and weary of Arthur's strict moral code. He whispered to them that Arthur's ideals were weakness. "Why waste our strength protecting the peasants? We are noble. It is our right to rule," he argued. These poisonous ideas resonated particularly with jealous and ambitious knights like Agravain, Gawain's brother. Mordred did not initiate open rebellion. He was a disease that decayed from within.
He mocked the slow pace of justice in the courts, exaggerated the knight's failures, and implied that the king was old and no longer the man he once was. Arthur failed to see his nephews and his sons' insidious rise, because Arthur, by nature, wanted to believe in the good in people. He could not believe that one of his own blood could bear such pure evil. This blindness was his greatest tragedy. But Mordred's greatest trump card was the relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere, a relationship that still hung like a bomb ready to explode. Mordred knew about this secret. It was the greatest weapon his mother, Morgana, had given him. He would use this secret to sever the last bonds that held the kingdom together. Collaborating with Agravain, he began plotting to catch the lovers red-handed and force Arthur to enforce his own laws against those he loved most. Mordred's rise marked the twilight of Camelot. He was the scorpion lurking in the shadow of the throne. While Arthur gazed upon distant enemies, the true enemy sat at his own table, drinking his own wine, and patiently awaiting the bloody day he would wear his father's crown.
The silence created by the empty seats of the Round Table and the spiritual void brought on by Merlin's absence had begun to make Camelot feel like a ghostly fortress. Mordred's rise had increased the whispers and suspicions within the palace corridors. Arthur could feel these fissures, this coldness at the heart of his kingdom. He was a born leader, and a leader knew that the antidote to internal turmoil was a shared external purpose. The quest for the Holy Grail had scattered his knights by leading them on a spiritual path. Now Arthur needed to unite those who remained behind in a worldly cause. If the kingdom's center was faltering, then its borders must be strengthened. Arthur turned his attention from the shadows within Camelot to the gaps on the map of Britain. This was not a lust for conquest, but a recovery, an effort to retain the momentum of a golden age. The ideal kingdom could not stand still. It must grow or die. Arthur first ordered a reconnaissance. The victory at Badon Hill had halted the Saxons, but the wild lands of the north, now Scotland, remained a mystery. The Caledonian forests, inhabited by Picts and Celtic tribes, were lands even Rome had failed to fully subdue. Arthur sent some of his most trusted remaining knights, those, like Gawain, who had not yet fully focused on the Grail quest or had prematurely completed the Grail quest, on diplomatic missions. This was not a military invasion. The knights went to these tribes carrying Arthur's banner of justice. They offered them trade, not plunder. They offered Arthur's arbitration to end their petty wars. This was an alliance of Celts with Celts, a call to unite against a common enemy, the Irish raiders from the north or the Saxons still roaming the coast. Surprisingly, many northern clan leaders respected the power of Badon's hero. Arthur's fame had prevailed over his sword. The seeds of a new alliance were sown. Camelot's influence had officially extended far beyond Hadrian's Wall, reaching places it had never reached before. At the same time, Arthur looked beyond the sea. Britain's fate had always been linked to Armorica, modern-day Brittany in France, known as Little Britain. Strengthening ties with its Celtic cousins there would give the kingdom strategic depth. Envoys were sent, ships set sail. King Hoel of Armorica recognized Arthur as High King and promised a military alliance against any potential Roman threat. Whispers circulated that the Roman Empire still claimed Britain, or Saxon invasion. On paper, Camelot had never been more powerful. Its borders extended to the mountains to the north, and its influence extended beyond the sea. New allies were won, maps were redrawn. These diplomatic victories were celebrated at Arthur's court. They were proof that the king still held sway, that the ideal was still alive. But this was a tragic illusion. Arthur was so preoccupied by expanding his kingdom that he failed to see how its center was being carved out. While he was writing letters to kings in distant lands, Mordred was plotting with the knights at his side. While he was signing peace treaties with the Picts in the north, the forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere was about to erupt into a scandal that would make peace impossible. These new alliances and discoveries were the last bright glimmer of Camelot's power, the last echo of a golden age. The kingdom appeared vast and solid on the outside, but its interior was already being eroded by Mordred's treachery and Lancelot's sin. The new allies were too distant to aid Arthur in the coming civil war.
While the quest for the Holy Grail had dissolved the Round Table, the spirit of Camelot lived on in the individual adventures of each knight. The kingdom was sustained not only by King Arthur's decrees, but also by the acts of justice and bravery displayed by his knights in the forests, distant castles, and tournament grounds. Each knight was a walking embodiment of the Round Table ideal, each bearing his own unique test, his own shadow. The brightest, most tragic, and most instructive stories of this period came from the two opposite poles of the table, Lancelot and Gawain. Sir Lancelot de Locke, even under the shadow of his love for the Queen, represented the physical pinnacle of chivalry. His tournament achievements were not merely sporting, but a declaration of Camelot's power. When Lancelot participated in a tournament, the outcome was predetermined from the outset. Other knights would only strive for second place. His grace on horseback, his impeccable timing with the spear, and his unparalleled speed with the sword were unrivaled. These tournaments were an expression of his inner conflict. While betraying his king, he had to become his king's greatest champion to cover up that betrayal. Every victory he won was dedicated to Guinevere's honor. It was a dangerous game played out in full view, yet one no one could truly identify. But Lancelot's heroism was more than just show. Once, when Queen Guinevere was kidnapped by Sir Meleagant, a treacherous knight, Lancelot risked everything to rescue her. When his horse was killed, he accepted a knight's greatest shame, riding a charnel cart, disregarding armor and honor, to reach the woman he loved. This epitomized his character, torn between duty, loyalty to Arthur, and heart, love for Guinevere. But this tornness transformed him into an even more dangerous and unpredictable hero. The other great hero at the table was Arthur's nephew, Sir Gawain. In contrast to Lancelot's grace and inner conflict, Gawain embodied raw power, Celtic fervor, and an unwavering, though sometimes blind, sense of honor. His greatest test began not in a tournament, but on a winter night in the halls of Camelot. At the New Year's feast, when all the knights had gathered, the gates opened, and in walked the Green Knight. A massive figure, completely green-skinned, clad in green armor, and wielding a massive axe. This supernatural being challenged Arthur's court to a Christmas game. "Let the bravest among you strike me with my axe. My only condition is that, after a year and a day, he come to the green chapel for me to strike him with the same blow." As the entire hall fell silent, it was Gawain who accepted the challenge in his king's stead. He took the axe and with a single blow decapitated the Green Knight. Instead of dying, however, the giant snatched his head from the ground, laughing, and said, "See you in a year in the Green Chapel, Sir Gawain," before leaving the hall. For a year, Gawain lived with the weight of this inevitable appointment. When the time came, he set out to keep his promise. This journey was his test. He was hosted in the castle of Lord Bertilac, whom he had encountered along the way. The lord offered him a deal. "I will hunt every day, you stay in the castle. When I return in the evening, we will exchange what we have gained that day." Gawain accepted. However, while Gawain was in the castle, the lord's beautiful wife tried to seduce him daily. To preserve the honor of his host house and his own vow of chastity, he resisted. The first day, he received only 1 kiss. The second day, 2. When the lord returned in the evening, Gawain returned those kisses honestly in exchange for the game. On the 3rd day, the lady offered him a magical green sash. Whoever wore it would be protected from death. Thinking of his appointment at the Green Chapel, Gawain accepted the sash in fear of his life. However, that evening, he refused to give the lord the sash he had won. He lied. When they arrived at the Green Chapel, the Green Knight sharpened his axe. Gawain offered his neck. The Green Knight struck the first blow, which Gawain flinched, and the knight mocked him.
He struck the second, but missed. On the third, he lightly scratched Gawain's neck with the axe's tip. As Gawain jumped to his feet, the Green Knight burst out laughing, transforming into Lord Bertilock himself. He explained that this whole game had been orchestrated by Morgana Le Fay, Gawain's mother, to test the honor of Arthur's knights. You survived the first 2 blows because you kept your word and returned my wife's kisses to me. But on the third, your neck was scratched because you hid that green sash from me. You lied for the love of your life. You are not entirely honorable, but neither are you entirely dishonorable. You are only human, Gawain. Gawain returned to Camelot bearing this sash and wound of shame. While Lancelot's heroism was fueled by a flawed love, Gawain's was tested by the fear of death. These individual stories prove that the Round Table was not just made up of invincible heroes, but also of complex people who feared, loved, and made mistakes.
While Camelot was reeling from the quiet tension of Lancelot and Guinevere's forbidden love, in another corner of the kingdom, on the craggy cliffs of Cornwall, a far crueler twist of fate unfolded. This was a tragedy sealed not by the oaths of the Round Table, but by the irresistible magic of the ancient world, the story of Tristan and Isolde. Their love was a bitter epic that demonstrated the fragility of Arthur's world in the face of the raw and untamable power of the human heart. Tristan was the nephew of King Mark of Cornwall and his bravest knight. Everything Lancelot meant to Camelot, Tristan meant to Cornwall. He was loyal to his king, invincible in battle, and a man of honor. When King Mark decided to marry Isolde the Golden-Haired, the daughter of the King of Ireland, to secure his kingdom, he entrusted his most trusted nephew, Tristan, with the task of bringing this precious bride. Tristan sailed to Ireland, defeated a dragon threatening the land, and won Isolde for his uncle. Tragedy began at sea on the return voyage. To ensure her daughter's happiness with this foreign king in Cornwall, Isolde's mother secretly gave her servant, Brangane, a magical love potion. This potion would bind those who drank it together forever, unstoppably, and with an irresistible passion. The potion was intended for Isolde and King Mark. But fate had a different plan. During the voyage, when Tristan and Isolde grew thirsty, Brangane, in a moment of distraction, both drank from the enchanted wine. In that moment, when they both set down their cups, they looked into each other's eyes and saw the world changing. This was not a love blossoming over time based on choices like Lancelot and Guinevere's. It was a magical, irresistible fire that swept through their veins, extinguishing their will, sealing their fates instantly and forever. They were no longer a loyal nephew to his uncle, nor a future queen. They were simply Tristan and Isolde. Upon arriving in Cornwall, everything continued as it should. Isolde married King Mark and became Queen of Cornwall. But both Tristan and Isolde now lived in a lie. Their vows of duty, honor, and loyalty were nothing compared to the magical and painful bond between their hearts. Their story echoed the one in Camelot, a wilder and more desperate version. While Lancelot and Guinevere battled guilt, Tristan and Isolde battled fate. Secret meetings, escapades in the forest, and growing suspicion in King Mark's heart. King Mark loved his nephew, but he also smelled betrayal. Jealous barons at court set traps to prove their love to the king. Eventually, like Lancelot and Guinevere, their treachery was revealed. King Mark's wrath was terrible. Tristan was sentenced to death, but managed to escape. For a time, the two lovers lived a wild but free life deep in the Morwa forest, far from civilization. But this love, however strong, could not find a place in the world. They had deceived a king and dishonored a kingdom. The consequences were devastating for both of them. Realizing the impossibility of their love and the damage they had inflicted on those around them,
Tristan returned Isolde to King Mark and exiled himself from Britain to Armorica, or Britonia. There, trying to forget Isolde, he married another woman, Isolde of the White Hands. But his heart never healed. Their tragic end, like their love, was inevitable. Tristan was mortally wounded by a poisoned sword in battle. He knew that the only person who could heal him was Isolde the Golden-Haired, who knew the healing herbs of Ireland. He sent him a ship and set a sign. If the ship sailed with Isolde, the sails would be white. If it sailed without her, the sails would be black. As Tristan lay in his bed awaiting death, his wife, Isolde the White-Handed, watched the horizon with jealousy. When the white-sailed ship appeared, his wife turned to Tristan in his bed and said, "The ship is coming. Its sails are black." In that moment of despair, Tristan whispered Isolde's name one last time and died. Just minutes later, Isolde the Golden-Haired rushed into the room, too late. Seeing the lifeless body of her beloved, her heart could not bear the pain, and she collapsed beside him, dying there. The story of Tristan and Isolde spread throughout Arthur's kingdom in the songs of the bards. It was not only a tragic love story, but also a warning. Passion could be stronger than duty, and love could demand a price that could shake the foundations of even the mightiest kingdoms.
While the legend of King Arthur is often told in the language of bards as a Christian epic of chivalry, beneath this shining armor and church bells beat a much older, darker heart. This was the soul of Britain before Rome, the heart of Celtic mythology, dwelling in the depths of forests, misty lakes, and mossy stone circles. While Camelot represented the new order of Christianity, it inevitably drew its power and mystery from these pagan roots. The most distinctive Celtic element of the legend was the figure of Merlin himself. More than a wise court advisor or a Christian wizard, Merlin was a reflection of the last great druid of the Old Order. Druids were the priests, judges, healers, and seers of Celtic society. They listened to the wisdom of oak trees, read fate from the movements of the stars, and commanded the raw power of nature. Merlin's prophetic abilities, shape-shifting abilities, such as transforming Uther into Gorlois, and deep connection to nature indicate that he belongs to this ancient tradition rather than Christianity. He was a bridge between two worlds, the last pagan sage who used the magic of the old world to establish Arthur's new order. Morgana Le Fay, however, was the other face of this pagan world. She represented the powerful, untamable, and often dangerous feminine energy of the Celtic pantheon, particularly goddesses of war and fate like the Morrigan. Morgana's magic, unlike Merlin's order-building magic, was chaotic, deceptive, and imbued with the vengeful power of nature. Avalon, the legendary island where she lived, was nothing less than a gateway to the other world in Celtic mythology, the misty boundary between the world of mortals and the world of fairies, the Fae or Fae. Even the symbols of Arthur's power came from this Celtic world. Excalibur was given to him not by the church, but by the Lady of the Lake. This figure was a direct reflection of one of the numerous Celtic lake and river goddesses. These pagan water spirits were seen as the source of power and legitimacy. The sword's origin from a stone or a lake, water, symbolized that Arthur's legitimacy came not only from God, but from the very land and nature of Britain itself. The kingdom teemed with magical creatures, the giants the knights fought, the dragons that cut through the forests, and the supernatural green knight that Gawain encountered. All of these were nature spirits and fairies that Christianity had tried to brand as devils, but that still held sway in the Celtic mind. The love potion that Tristan and Isolde drank was not a product of alchemy, but a manifestation of the inescapable concept of fate, or geese in Celtic, a concept frequently found in Celtic tales that disregards free will.
Pagan rituals permeated court life. Even the quest for the Holy Grail, though it may appear to be a Christian relic quest, was fundamentally borrowed from a Celtic myth, the motif of searching for magical objects, such as the Dagda's cauldron or the horns of plenty in Celtic mythology, that offer eternal food and wisdom, but are only available to the worthy. Knights embarking on quests lasting a year and a day was a reference to the sacred time cycles dictated by the Celtic calendar and rituals. Arthur's legend is essentially a story of Britain's spiritual transformation. He was a king standing between the old Celtic gods and the new Christian god. His kingdom was a battleground where these two worlds collided, sometimes dancing in harmony, sometimes striving to destroy each other. Without these Celtic elements, Arthur's story would be merely a king's political struggle, but through this ancient magic, it became the enduring epic of a nation's soul.
With Merlin's disappearance, Arthur had lost not only his wisest advisor, but also his guide, one who could interpret the mists of the future. With Merlin present, fate was like a river that could be manipulated and shaped. Without Merlin, fate became a suffocating fog that descended upon Arthur, a weight he could not understand but felt. With his knights scattered and his mentor silent, Arthur was more alone than ever on the throne of his kingdom, and in this solitude, his dreams and prophecies remained as his darkest companions. Arthur could no longer sleep peacefully at night. The dreams of victory and unity he had known in the glorious days of the Golden Age had been replaced by eerie, fragmented, and symbolic nightmares. These dreams carried warnings of the future, but without Merlin's interpretation, these warnings were mere torture. His most frequent dream was a vision of the Wheel of Fortune, which woke him in terror. In his dream, he saw himself sitting on his throne as a king at the very top of a vast, sky-high wheel. Beneath him, his kingdom lay in peace and prosperity, but the wheel was beginning to turn. Slowly, inexorably, it turned, sending Arthur plummeting from the summit into darkness. At the bottom of the wheel, a bottomless pit awaited him, and within it, writhing snakes, scorpions, and Mordred's face. No matter how hard he struggled, he could not stop the wheel's rotation, knowing that the price of that brief moment at the summit would be an inevitable fall. In another nightmare, he saw himself sitting at the round table in his great hall, but the knights' seats were empty. Suddenly, the doors of the hall opened, and in walked Lancelot, his arms bandaged, his face drawn with grief. The moment Arthur smiled at his friend, Lancelot drew his sword and split the table in two. At that very moment, he heard Queen Guinevere scream. He awoke, his heart pounding at the sound of his own scream. These dreams fed not Arthur's paranoia, but his tragic intuition. He knew something was fundamentally wrong. He sensed that Lancelot's devotion to Guinevere was more fervent than a champion's. He could sense the cold hatred behind Mordred's smile. He knew how the foundations of his kingdom had been undermined by the two people he trusted most, his dearest friend and his dearest wife, and his own son of blood. Merlin's final prophecies, the cryptic words he had spoken before his disappearance, now echoed in his mind as bitter truths. The greatest betrayal will come from those closest to you, and the seed you sow with your own blood will be your harvest. Arthur now understood the meaning of these prophecies, but what could he do as a king? Precautions had to be taken, but each seemed impossible. Should he banish his finest knight and friend, Lancelot, for the sake of suspicion? Wouldn't that tear the kingdom in two? Should he accuse his wife Guinevere of treason without proof? Wouldn't that undermine Camelot's very principles of justice? And Mordred? Should he punish her simply for her bad blood and her father's nightmares? Wouldn't that be no different than Uther Pendragon's tyranny? Arthur was trapped in his own system of justice. To be an ideal king, he had to act on evidence, not suspicion. But he knew that when that evidence surfaced, it would be too late.
His dreams and prophecies showed him the future, but as a king, his hands were tied. He knew his fate, yet he could not stop it. This was his greatest tragedy. He had to watch the fall of his kingdom like a waking nightmare.
When the Knights of the Round Table left the safe walls of Camelot, they left the world they knew behind. The forests, roads, and castles they had conquered before now seemed different. The air was thicker, the silence deeper. This was no longer an adventure in pursuit of giants or bandits. It was a journey charting their own souls in pursuit of God's mystery. The Grail itself was invisible, but the signs of its presence were everywhere. Surprising, personal, and often painful. The first signs came in the form of miracles and trials, demonstrating that this quest would be won not by the sword, but by faith. Each knight encountered a reflection of his own character and sins. Sir Gawain, the most eager of worldly glory, found a magnificent chapel at a crossroads, adorned with rich fabrics. Inside, a feast and a soft bed awaited him in which to rest. But just as he lay down, all that wealth turned to ashes and dust, and the food rotted. A voice whispered, "He who seeks the holy does not tarry with the worldly." It was then that Gawain realized for the first time that his chivalrous skills, kindness, and strength would be of no avail in this quest. This angered him, but it also fueled his ambition. Sir Lancelot, the bearer of the greatest sin, encountered the most painful sign of all. After days of riding, exhausted, he reached a forest clearing. There, on a stone altar, he saw the veiled Grail. Just as in Camelot, it radiated a divine light. Lancelot dismounted and ran toward it, yearning to touch it to purify his sin and experience that peace. But just a few steps from the Grail, an invisible force struck him in the chest. He collapsed, his body paralyzed. When he opened his eyes, the Grail was gone. For hours, perhaps days, he lay there, buried in the mud, unable to move under the weight of his sin. This was the first sign the Grail gave him. Even the greatest warrior, if his heart is not pure, cannot approach me. Lancelot swore at that moment to pursue this quest not for victory, but for penance. The young Sir Percival, known for his purity and innocence, encountered a different mystery. One stormy night, in a castle he sought refuge in, the Fisher King's castle, he witnessed a strange procession. First, a shining spear with blood dripping from its tip, the Holy Lance, passed through the room, followed by a young girl holding the Grail. The room was filled with divine light. Percival was so captivated by this miracle that, obeying the rule of asking unnecessary questions taught to him in his knightly training, he remained silent. "What is this Grail? Why does this spear bleed? Who do you serve?" He did not ask. The procession vanished as silently as it had arrived. The mystery of the Grail had been revealed to Percival, but his innocence had failed the test. When he left the castle, he realized his mistake, and his motivation became not only to find the Grail, but also to attain the wisdom to ask the right question. And finally there was Sir Galahad, the chosen knight of the Grail. He didn't have to search for signs. Signs found him. On his first day on the road, he encountered a different sword, the Sword of Destiny, embedded in a rock bearing the inscription, "Only the greatest knight in the world can draw me." Galahad drew this sword, which even his father Lancelot couldn't draw, with the same ease Arthur had drawn Excalibur. Shortly after, he encountered angels or mysterious messengers bearing a pure white shield with a red cross. The Grail didn't offer Galahad mysteries, but rather granted him weapons and armor. These first signs radically changed the knight's motivation. The Grail quest was not a quest to bring glory to Camelot. It was a personal journey of purification that each of them undertook deep within their own soul, a journey in which most would fail and few would survive.
With Merlin absent
and the purest knights of the Round Table scattered in the quest for the Holy Grail, the magical shield over Camelot had cracked. The stage was now fully set for Morgana le Fay, who wielded the ancient power of Britain. Arthur's kingdom, while seemingly strong on the outside, was spiritually vulnerable, and Morgana's attacks would be waged not with steel, but with shadow and deception. Her machinations were far deeper than the damage an army could inflict. Her aim was to destroy not Arthur's body, but his soul and the ideals of his kingdom. Morgana's first target was the quest for the Holy Grail itself. This Christian miracle was an affront to the ancient pagan order she represented. The success of this quest meant the complete oblivion of the Celtic gods and the power of Avalon. Therefore, she used her magic to lead the questing knights astray. The knights seeking the Grail frequently encountered her illusions in the forests. Sometimes she conjured false visions of the Grail, luring them into marshes or dead-end valleys. Sometimes she disguised herself as their deepest desires. She attempted to break the pious Sir Percival's vow of chastity by appearing before him as a helpless, seductive maiden. She arranged magical tournaments for Gawain, promising him eternal worldly glory. Morgana's trap, unlike the divine trials that tested the purity of knights, was designed to tarnish their purity. But Morgana's true hatred was focused on Arthur, who remained in Camelot. In Merlin's absence, she played one of her most daring games against Arthur, the attempted theft of Excalibur. She arrived in Camelot disguised as a friendly queen and won Arthur's trust. During a hunting expedition, she caught Arthur asleep and stole both his sword, Excalibur, and the enchanted scabbard that protected Arthur from harm. When Arthur awoke, he discovered that not only his sword, but also his immortality had been stolen. When he pursued Morgana, the enchantress caught him by a lake. She threw the scabbard into the deepest depths of the lake. "Where Excalibur came from, may its guard return too," she taunted. And just as she was about to be captured, he turned himself into stone and escaped. Arthur had regained his sword, but the scabbard was lost forever. King Arthur was now mortal. Like any knight, he could bleed and die. This was Morgana's greatest preparation for Mordred's final battle. Morgana's machinations weren't limited to magical traps, they were also political. She used her spies and loyalists to undermine Arthur's kingdom from within. She planted poisonous whispers in the ears of jealous knights at court, like Agravain. She deliberately spread rumors of a forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere, paving the way for the secret to rise from a mere whisper to an open accusation. Its most dangerous trap, however, was a magical place known as the Chapel of No Return, the Perilous, where reality and illusion intertwined. This was a pocket universe controlled by Morgana, where knights on the Grail path, or those lost, found themselves lost. Those who entered this chapel were forced to confront their greatest fears, their failures, and the ghosts of lost loved ones. It is said that Lancelot was tested in this chapel by the Queen's vision, while Arthur was caught in the illusions of Merlin betraying him. This was a battle that targeted not only the knights' bodies, but also their mental health. Morgana le Fay was no longer just a vengeful queen in exile. She was an active saboteur undermining Camelot. Her spells and traps were systematically eroding the foundations of Arthur's kingdom, built on justice, honor, and loyalty.
Camelot was not merely a powerful fortress or a political capital. It was an experiment based on a moral ideal. At the heart of this experiment was the Round Table and the oaths sworn upon it. The revolution Arthur brought to Britain was a moral triumph rather than a military one. It changed the very definition of chivalry.
No longer was a knight simply a warlord who could ride, wield a sword, and plunder. A knight of the Round Table had to abide by the highest code of honor in the world. These oaths were a sacred contract made by each new knight upon entering the table, placing his hand on the hilt of Excalibur. This was an oath not only to the king, but to God and the ideal they represented. The code of honor was renewed annually at Pentecost and was clear. You shall never commit tyranny, murder, or cruelty. Might does not mean right. You shall always stand for justice and fight treason. You shall show mercy at all costs. No matter how vile an enemy, mercy shall be granted to those who cry out for mercy. You shall always help women, widows, and orphans. Protecting them was a knight's primary duty. You shall never bully women or force them into dishonorable behavior. You shall fight only for the honor of God and the king, not for worldly gain or personal gain. These oaths were the cement that held the table together. They were the chains that bound Lancelot to Gawain and Percival to Kay. The roundness of the table symbolized that everyone, including King Arthur, was equal before these oaths. No one was above these rules. The sanctity of the Round Table stemmed from unwavering adherence to these rules. But human nature was more complex than even the most sacred oaths, and the violation of these oaths would inevitably lead to disaster. The consequences of breaking an oath illustrated the kingdom's understanding of justice. If a knight violated one of these rules, for example, killing someone unjustly or bullying a woman, he would be brought before King Arthur's court of justice. The punishment was usually banishment from the Round Table, the breaking of his armor and shield, dishonoring his honor, and exile. This was a fate worse than death for a knight. However, the most dangerous violations were those that could not be brought to trial, remaining secret. Lancelot's relationship with Guinevere was the most complex and devastating violation of these oaths. Lancelot violated his vows of loyalty to his king and honorable treatment of women, which included cheating on the queen, daily. This violation had no earthly consequences, yet, because no one could prove it. But the spiritual consequences were dire. In the quest for the Holy Grail, this was the answer to Lancelot's failure to attain the Grail. His oath had been broken, his soul tainted. Similarly, Sir Gawain's fear of losing his green sash and lying during the Green Knight's trial violated his vows of honesty and keeping his word. His punishment was the small wound inflicted by the Green Knight and the shameful mark Gawain would bear on his neck for the rest of his life. The Round Table's vows were both Camelot's greatest strength and its most tragic weakness. These ideals were so lofty that achieving them was nearly impossible. All Morgana and Mordred had to do was wait for these seemingly flawless knights to inevitably stumble, and then turn that stumble into an earthquake that would destroy the entire kingdom.
From the outside, Sir Lancelot du Lac possessed everything God could have bestowed upon a knight. Raised by the Lady of the Lake, he was unrivaled in the arts of war, a master of tourneys, known as the flower of chivalry. He was King Arthur's most trusted friend, Queen Guinevere's champion. Every knight of the Round Table secretly longed to be like him. But within this shining armor lived a man crushed by the weight of his worldly glory, cursed by his own treachery. Lancelot's inner conflict was the deepest fault line that would determine the fate of Camelot. His tragedy was that he was torn between two absolute loyalties, duty and love. Duty. Lancelot's love and loyalty for Arthur were deeper than a nephew's love for his father. Arthur had given Lancelot not just a place, but a purpose. He had placed her at the head of the Round Table and entrusted her with the most honorable duties in Britain.
Lancelot believed wholeheartedly in Arthur's ideals, his vision of justice, and his kingdom. He was ready to die 1,000 times for his king without hesitation. Arthur's unwavering trust in him was both Lancelot's greatest honor and his heaviest burden. Every time Arthur smiled at him with a friendly smile, every time he called him the man I trust most, it was a dagger driven into Lancelot's heart. On the other hand, there was Guinevere. Lancelot's love for the queen was not an emotion he could control or choose. She had become an inseparable part of his soul, like the potion Tristan and Isolde drank. Guinevere was not just the king's wife to him, but the earthly manifestation of his cherished ideal of courtly courtesy, beauty, and grace. He adored her. For a glance, a smile from Guinevere, he would embark on the most dangerous quests and win the most impossible battles. These two loves, one sacred, friendship and loyalty, the other forbidden, adultery and betrayal, could not coexist in the same heart. Lancelot woke up every day with this question of conscience. Every moment he met with the queen in secret was tainting not only his Round Table vows, but also the trust of the man he respected most in the world. This inner conflict made him an even greater knight. To suppress his guilt, he was driven to prove himself, to undertake more dangerous missions, to shed more blood for his king. Any enemy of Arthur became Lancelot's personal enemy. He believed that if he performed enough heroic deeds, if he made enough sacrifices, he could offset the weight of his sin. However, this only resulted in his gaining more glory and honor, further strengthening Arthur's trust in him and making the burden of betrayal even heavier. The quest for the Holy Grail was the culmination of Lancelot's inner conflict. As the greatest knight in the world, he was closer than anyone to finding the Grail. But each time he approached the Grail's gate, divine power repelled him. The Grail sought spiritual purity, not physical strength, and Lancelot's soul was tainted by betrayal. He glimpsed the Grail only once through a foggy glass. This was his greatest shame. He had won every earthly battle, but lost the spiritual. His sin had robbed him of God's grace. When he returned to Camelot from his quest, Lancelot was a changed man. He was no longer just guilty, but also spiritually defeated. He vowed to stay away from the queen, to end their relationship, and to live as a hermit. But whenever he saw Guinevere's face, his vow was broken, his will crumbling. He was a prisoner of his own honor and love, unable to be completely loyal to his king or completely abandon the woman he loved. This indecision, this painful contradiction, would create the perfect moment of weakness for Mordred and Agravain to spring their trap.
History often records the battles of kings and the tragedies of knights, but the true wonder of Camelot's golden age unfolded not in the great halls, but in the fields, marketplaces, and homes of the common people. Before Arthur's accession to the throne, Britain experienced a period of chaos known as the Lawless Days. Petty kings and cruel lords seized the peasants' crops, bandits blocked the roads, and justice was the preserve of those with the strongest sword. People lived in constant fear, worried about the next harvest or the next invasion. Camelot ended this fear. Arthur's justice, emanating from the Round Table, brought predictability and security to the common people for the first time. A farmer knew he would reap the wheat he sowed because the justice of the Knights of the Round Table prevented cruel lords from seizing it. A merchant, transporting his goods from one city to another, knew that he was more likely to encounter a patrolling knight than bandits in the forest. This security gave rise to unprecedented prosperity. Fields were cultivated, warehouses filled. As warfare declined, blacksmiths began to forge plowshares instead of swords. Trading ships began to ply the rivers, and new markets sprang up in the cities. Camelot became not just a fortress, but a metropolis, drawing merchants, artisans, and artists from across the continent. Silks, spices, fine wines, and rare books became standard commodities in Camelot's marketplace. But the Golden Age wasn't just one of economic prosperity, it was also a cultural renaissance. Arthur and Guinevere were patrons of the arts and refinement. The rough warrior culture gave way to courtly courtliness. The castle's great hall was not only a place where battle plans were made, but also a stage where bards and minstrels presented their latest songs and legends. Tristan's mastery of the harp or Lancelot's aptitude for poetry was as highly regarded as their mastery of the sword. Knights were expected to be not only strong, but also gentle, educated, and compassionate. This also elevated the status of women in society. Under Guinevere's patronage, women were no longer mere pawns in political marriages, but became central figures in courtly culture, art, and courtesy. Festivals were the times that Camelot celebrated this new way of life. 3 major festivals were held throughout the year: Christmas, winter solstice, Easter, spring, and Pentecost, summer. During these festivals, people from all over the kingdom flocked to Camelot. Pentecost was the grandest celebration, particularly the annual reconvening of the Round Table and the renewal of vows. Tournaments lasted for weeks, where knights demonstrated their skills. But these tournaments were not bloody battles, but honorable competitions with rules. At night, vast feasts were held, and the halls echoed with music, dancing, and laughter. The people were a part of these celebrations. The king and queen drank the same wine and sang along with the humblest peasant. Daily life in Camelot was like a dream, an ideal come true. Justice, prosperity, and art were united in a harmony never before seen. That is why the kingdom's downfall would be so tragic. Mordred's treachery and Lancelot's sin would destroy not only a king and a chivalric order, but also the unparalleled era of peace and prosperity enjoyed by the common people.
Camelot's golden age was built on Arthur's crushing victory at Badon Hill, Chapter 5. That victory silenced the Saxon threat for a generation, giving Britain a chance to breathe and establish its ideal kingdom. But history rarely records lasting peace. While Arthur's kingdom was preoccupied internally with the quest of the Holy Grail, the loss of Merlin, and palace intrigues, enemies waited patiently beyond its borders, regrouping. The long peace was about to end. The greatest and most existential threat, as always, was the Saxons. Those defeated at Badon were driven back to their settlements on the island's eastern coast, Saxon Shore. For years they remained silent, trading, and some even sought refuge in Arthur's justice. But new and more ruthless waves continued to arrive from across the sea, from northern Germany and Denmark. These newcomers had no respect for Arthur's peace treaties or the reputation of the Round Table. They smelled only one thing: weakness. Whispers from Camelot had reached the ears of the Saxon warlords. News that Merlin had vanished, that the Round Table's finest warriors, Lancelot, Galahad, and Percival, had vanished in pursuit of an invisible grail, and that the king's court was divided by treachery and scandal, was an invitation to them. The raids began again, but this time they weren't small bands coming for plunder. These were invaders, arriving with their families, intent on seizing the land permanently. Castles along the eastern coast began to fall, and villages began to burn. Arthur was forced to send his remaining knights, like Gawain and Kay, to deal with this threat. But these new battles were nothing like the heroic clashes at Badon. This was a brutal, exhausting, and inconclusive frontier warfare fought in marshes and forests. Camelot's resources were slowly being drained by this relentless defense. The Saxons weren't the only problem. Old enemies were also stirring within Britain. The 11 rebel Celtic kings whom Arthur had defeated in the early battles but shown mercy had submitted to Arthur's power, not his ideal. Now, seeing the High King distracted and his finest knights away, they saw an opportunity to reclaim their former independence or challenge Arthur's authority. Some lords in the north and west refused to send aid to Arthur against the Saxons, and some even secretly sought alliances with the invaders. And then, amidst all this chaos, the most unexpected, most imposing threat emerged: the shadow of Rome. When Arthur united Britain and rose to fame as High King, news of it reached the continent. The Roman Empire, or the power that claimed its heir in the West, still considered Britain a lost province. Arthur's audacity to establish an empire of his own was perceived as an insult. According to legend, emissaries from Rome arrived at Camelot, not with an offer of peace or alliance, but with an ultimatum. Roman Emperor Lucius demanded that Arthur immediately recognize Roman suzerainty and pay the tributes that had not been paid since the time of Uther. This was an impossible demand for Arthur. He had fought to liberate Britain from the yoke of a foreign power, not to restore it to a province. Arthur's no to Rome meant an inevitable declaration of war. Now Arthur had to not only defend his borders, but also prepare his entire kingdom against a massive invasion from the continent. The kingdom was trapped in a vice: Saxon invaders in the east, rebellious lords within, and a Roman threat from the west, the continent. Arthur had to direct all his strength and attention to these external threats. He began making plans to gather his army, call on his allies, and perhaps even take the war to the continent itself, to France. And this was the moment Mordred had been waiting for. With the king focused all his might on the external enemy, the heart of the kingdom, the throne itself, was left vulnerable to the greatest betrayal in history.
The Round Table was a brotherhood formed not by flawless knights, but by imperfect men. This was precisely the genius of Arthur's ideal. It brought together not an army of angels, but mortals battling their own inner demons. The power of the Golden Age derived from the virtues of these knights, but the kingdom's downfall would also stem directly from their flaws. Every knight was a reflection of the complexity of human nature. Their greatest strengths were also the source of their most tragic weaknesses. Lancelot's greatest virtue was his capacity for loyalty and love. When he loved with all his being, unquestioningly. His loyalty to Arthur made him the greatest champion. His love for Guinevere made him the most passionate lover. He was invincible in battle, merciful and generous. He was the very embodiment of the physical ideal of chivalry. His tragedy was that he held these two absolute loves simultaneously. His loyalty made him the greatest hero, while that same loyalty turned into betrayal made him the greatest sinner. This was why he failed to find the Holy Grail. His loyalty to his own passion overcame his loyalty to his king. Lancelot was too human to be the ideal knight. Gawain, Arthur's nephew, embodied the raw Celtic power and unwavering honor of the table. He was a man of his word, brave and devoted to his family, especially Arthur and his brothers, unto death. His bowing his neck before the Green Knight was a testament to his honor and his promise. Gawain's honor could often turn into arrogance and ruthless rage. He lacked Lancelot's compassion. For him, the world was black and white, honorable and unhonorable. His greatest weakness was the combination of this rigid sense of honor and his blind devotion to his family. Lancelot's accidental killing of Gawain's brothers, Gareth and Gaheris, while rescuing the queen, would turn Gawain's honor into a thirst for vengeance, and he would become one of the key figures who led Arthur into battle against Lancelot, bringing about the kingdom's end. While Mordred was considered inherently evil, he also possessed a virtue, his intelligence and charisma. He saw more clearly than anyone the flaws in Arthur's justice system, the hypocrisy of the knights, and the cracks within the kingdom. His ability to rally the disillusioned showed that he too possessed leadership potential. His entire existence was built upon the rejection of his father, Arthur. This rejection transformed his intelligence into ambition and his potential into pure hatred. He sought not to reform the kingdom, but to destroy it, for that kingdom had branded him a sin before he was even born. Arthur's half-brother Kay was the most loyal yet most cynical member of the table. He knew Arthur as a brother before he became king. This gave him the right to be more honest, more unfiltered than anyone else. He was the king's link to reality, the honest, rugged voice behind the courtly politeness. Kay's flaw was his jealousy and irascibility. His brother's rise to king was like being robbed of his own inheritance. He was loyal, yes, but he also felt overwhelmed by the glamour of new heroes like Lancelot or Gawain. This often made him irritable, quarrelsome, and someone who didn't fully embrace Arthur's ideals. These two knights were the spiritual pole of the table. Their virtue lay in their being pure from worldly sins, lust, pride, and ambition. Galad, like the atonement for Lancelot's sin, represented perfect purity. Percival, on the other hand, symbolized the innocence that came to this purity through experience. Their flaw was that they were too naive for the political games and complexities of this world. The quest for the Holy Grail led to their removal from this world. While the kingdom burned under the machinations of Mordred, the spiritual power that needed it most was unconcerned with worldly matters. Their naivety made them worthy of heaven, but prevented them from saving Camelot. These complex characters formed the basis of Camelot's tragedy. The kingdom would fall not from an external enemy, but from the flaws within these great heroes, the inevitable conflicts within their own human natures.
The quest for the Holy Grail had tossed the Round Table like a sieve. Knights possessing worldly glory, arrogance, or secret sins were eliminated one by one in this spiritual storm. Lancelot, crushed by the weight of his own sin, could only witness the Grail's brilliance from afar, in pain. Gawain could not see beyond worldly honor and the lust for vengeance, and failed to understand spiritual trials. The quest had become a purely spiritual journey, where brute force or chivalric skill no longer meant anything. Only 3 souls remained deemed worthy to approach this divine mystery. These 3 were the Grail's chosen: Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors. Their journey was no longer one of swordplay, but of agonizing moral choices. The Grail sent them not monsters or giants, but a mirror of the deepest conflicts of their own souls. Sir Percival embodied innocence and purity, but his greatest test was to learn that purity alone was not enough. Years ago, when he witnessed the Grail procession at the Fisher King's castle, he had obeyed the rule taught to a knight not to ask unnecessary questions, refusing to ask the grieving king, "What has become of you?" or "Who serves the Grail?" This innocent silence had been his greatest mistake. Now he had to atone for that mistake. He resisted the illusions that presented him as a seductive woman disguised as the devil. His test was to move from passive innocence to active wisdom and compassion. He had not only to be pure of heart, but to use that heart to ask the right questions. Sir Bors was the most earthly of the 3, the most human. He was not born perfect like Galahad. He was a man trying to be good in an imperfect world. Therefore, the test the Grail presented him was the harshest moral choice imaginable.
When he came to a crossroads, he was met with a horrific sight. On one side, his brother, Sir Lionel, had been captured by enemies, his naked body tied to a tree, and he was being whipped with thorny branches. Simultaneously, on the other side, an innocent maiden was being abducted, screaming, by a mounted knight and dragged deep into the forest to be raped. Bors could not save them both. With a heavy heart, he chose the oath of the Round Table to protect the innocent and women over his own blood and family love. He abandoned his brother, in his eyes, to death and galloped to rescue the maiden. This terrible sacrifice proved that he could subordinate worldly love to divine duty and a sacred oath, and it was this moment that made him worthy. But Sir Galahad was different. He was not subject to the trials or moral choices of this world. He was the sword of fate itself, a pure instrument born as atonement for Lancelot's sin. He bore Lancelot's blood, but not his sin. His journey was not one of purification, but of fulfillment. He performed miracles wherever he went. He drew the sword of destiny, took the magical shield, and his very presence was enough to drive away demons and heal the sick. He was the quest itself. Finally, these three knights reached the mysterious Corbenic castle, where the Grail was hidden. There they found the wounded Fisher King, who had been writhing in pain for years. Galahad, with his divine purity, entered the chamber where the Grail was located. This time, Percival did not repeat his mistake and asked the right question. When Galahad took the Holy Grail into his hands, the Fisher King was healed, and with it, the barren lands became green again. That night, the veil covering the Grail was completely lifted. Galahad saw the image of God, a vision beyond mortal eyes. After experiencing this absolute grace, it was impossible for him to remain on this sinful earth. His soul was taken directly to heaven by the angels. After witnessing the miracle, Percival retired from the world and became a monk, dying peacefully soon after. Sir Bors was the only one who completed the quest and returned to Camelot to tell the tale. He returned to inform the Round Table that the Grail had been found, but now it had been taken from this world. The quest was over. The kingdom's spiritual test was over, but its finest knights had been taken from it.
Merlin was now trapped in a crystal cave. His voice had been silenced, his presence withdrawn from Britain. As Arthur gazed upon the empty chairs of the Round Table, the growing pressure of external threats, the Saxons, Rome, and Mordred's cold shadow in the palace, the loneliness he felt was absolute and profound. The magic was gone. The prophecies had fallen silent. All that remained was what Merlin had taught him. Arthur must face the coming storm of his kingdom not with his teacher's magic, but with his own wisdom. Merlin's training for Arthur was not simply that of a king. As Arthur grew up under Sir Ector, Merlin visited him frequently, teaching him not only to wield a sword or ride a horse, but also to think. His lessons were not conventional. They were often painful, metaphorical, and unforgettable. Merlin's most fundamental lesson was about power. Once, to teach young Arthur a lesson, he magically transformed him into a fish and threw him into a lake. As Arthur struggled to escape a massive pike, he learned that strength wasn't absolute. Even the largest fish had a weakness. He then transformed him into a falcon, showing him what it meant to be a master of the sky, but also teaching him that even the highest flying bird was vulnerable to the storm. Merlin's lesson was, strength lies not in the sharpness of your sword, but in observing wisely enough to know when your enemy will strike. Strength lies not in brute force, but in understanding. The principle of might is right, not right is not, the foundation of Arthur's kingdom, was born from these lessons. Strategic thinking was another important teaching from Merlin.
Arthur often recalled the chess-like Celtic game Fidchel that Merlin had taught him. Never go to the battlefield with only one plan, Merlin would tell him. Remember that even the most insignificant pawn can overthrow a king. And most importantly, read your opponent's intentions, not just his moves. Why do people fight, Arthur? For land? No. They fight for fear, greed, or pride. Understand their pride, and you will anticipate their moves. Arthur's strategies against Rome and the Saxons reflected this lesson. He viewed his enemies not merely as military targets, but as psychological adversaries. To defeat them, he needed not only the sword, but the ability to manage their fears and greed. But Merlin's greatest legacy was his leadership qualities. Merlin taught Arthur that a king should never say, "I." You are not a crown, Arthur. You are a symbol. You are a reflection of what the best of your people can be. If you are just, your kingdom will be just. If you are merciful, your knights will be merciful. But if you, like Uther, become a slave to your own desires, your kingdom will fall with you. Now, as everything around Arthur collapsed, these words resonated more than ever. Lancelot's betrayal was looming. Mordred's resentment was growing. Arthur could not allow his personal pain, his anger, or his desire for revenge to rule his kingdom. He had to transcend being a man, as Merlin had taught him, to become that symbol who must remain calm no matter how great the storm. Merlin's wisdom was Arthur's last shield. Magic was gone, but strategy remained. The prophecies were gone, but the principle of justice remained. His teacher was gone, but his lessons shone in the king's mind as a last light against the approaching darkness.
Mordred had waited in the shadows of Camelot with the patience of a spider. He wasn't a man who shouted in anger like Gawain or acted passionately like Lancelot. He was a cold-blooded, calculating master who had spent years studying every crack, every weakness of Arthur's ideal kingdom. The vacuum created by the quest for the Holy Grail, Merlin's absence, and Arthur's shift of attention to external threats, Rome and the Saxons, had provided Mordred with that perfect darkness. Their plan wasn't to incite rebellion by brute force, but to suffocate the kingdom under its own weight, its own ideals. His strategy was to corrupt from within. Mordred saw through the hypocrisy of the Round Table. He knew that the knights swore sacred oaths, but committed secret sins, that the king spoke of justice, but turned a blind eye, or ignored, to his closest friend's betrayal. His plan was to expose this hypocrisy for all to see. His first step was to gain supporters. He targeted those dissatisfied with the kingdom. He found those who returned empty-handed from the quest for the Holy Grail, those who had failed spiritually and were therefore jealous that sinful knights like Lancelot were still favored by the king. Tired of being in Lancelot's shadow, he gathered around him those who desired more power and land. His greatest ally was Gawain's brother, Sir Agravain. Agravain loathed Lancelot's fame and his obvious influence over the queen. Mordred skillfully preyed on Agravain's jealousy. "Is our king blind?" he whispered to him. "His best knight is dishonoring his bed and his honor, and he is plotting war against Rome. It is not for the hypocritical Lancelot, but for us, the true faithful, to defend the honor of this kingdom." Mordred's secret plan was simple yet deadly: to catch Lancelot and Guinevere red-handed, a fact Arthur could not deny. This wasn't just a trap set by jealousy, it was a domino. Mordred knew that if Lancelot and the queen's treachery were officially proven, Arthur would fall prey to his own laws as king. The Round Table's sacred oaths, chapter 18, forbade treason and adultery. Arthur would be forced to judge his queen Guinevere, and possibly, according to the harsh laws of the time, condemn her to be burned at the stake. When this happened, one of two outcomes was inevitable.
Lancelot would never allow the queen to be executed. He would fight to save her, which would lead him into open rebellion against the king. The Round Table would be divided between those who supported Lancelot and those who remained loyal to the king. If Arthur failed to uphold his laws and pardoned the woman he loved, then the entire kingdom he had built on justice would be built on a lie. The Round Table's oaths would be rendered meaningless, and the respect of the other knights, especially those of strict honor like Gawain, for the king would be destroyed. Either way, the outcome was the same. The fellowship of the Round Table would end, and the kingdom would be plunged into civil war. Mordred and Agravain waited for the right moment to execute their plan. They chose a night when Arthur was focused on the Roman campaign. They went to the king and said, "Lord, a rumor has been circulating for a long time. We must prove our loyalty to you. Lancelot will be in the queen's chambers tonight." Pained by this accusation, Arthur reluctantly gave them permission. Mordred had set his trap. Along with 12 knights, including Agravain, they lay in wait outside the queen's chambers. The web of treachery, slowly being woven, was about to snap, and the fate of Camelot would be decided behind that door that night.
Mordred's trap slammed shut with brutal finality that night on the door of Queen Guinevere's chamber. Inside were Lancelot and Guinevere. Outside were 12 knights led by Sir Agravain, and Mordred watched from the shadows. "Traitor Lancelot," Agravain shouted, "you betray the king's bed. Stand before our king, armed and armored, and face justice." In that moment, all the sacred concepts that held Camelot together, marriage, friendship, loyalty, were thrown into an impossible test. The boundaries of each would be drawn in blood on either side of that door. Inside, Lancelot was unarmed, armed only with his sword. He had no armor. Before him stood the most terrible choice of his life. His love. His love for Guinevere made it impossible for him to let her die. If they surrendered, the queen would face the stake. This was unacceptable to him. Friendship and duty. His loyalty to King Arthur forbade him from drawing his sword against his men, his brothers of the Round Table. Surrender would be the final, painful proof of his loyalty to his king. But in Lancelot's nature, love always trumped duty. When he saw Guinevere's horrified face, his choice became clear. Oaths of friendship and loyalty burned to ashes in that moment. Only his love's fierce instinct to protect remained. He opened the door slightly, drew the first knight in, took his sword, donned his armor, and opened the door. Outside, Sir Agravain and the others faced Lancelot's wrath. This was no tournament. This was a fight for survival for the greatest warrior cornered. Lancelot fought with grief and rage. Steel clashed against steel in the hallway. Within seconds, Agravain and nearly all the knights who had set the trap were dead. Lancelot, covered in blood, protected the woman he loved, but in doing so, he had officially declared war on his king. He mounted his horse and fled Camelot. Amidst this carnage, the bitterest seed of tragedy was sown. Among the fallen knights were Gawain's 2 younger, innocent and beloved brothers, Sir Gareth and Sir Gaheris. They had reluctantly joined the trap out of admiration for Lancelot, and it was even said they were unarmed. Lancelot, in the blind fury of battle, did not recognize them and slaughtered them. When the news reached King Arthur, his world fell apart. He was now forced to confront not rumors, but proof. His marriage? His wife, Guinevere, had been captured in her chamber with his most trusted knight. The bond of marriage had been broken beyond repair. His friendship. His best friend Lancelot had slaughtered his men and fled. Years of friendship were drowned in the bloodshed that night. His loyalty. Duty. Arthur was no longer a husband or a friend. He was king, and as king, he was bound by the laws he had established. The Round Table's oaths had been broken. The queen's guilt was established. Justice had to be served. Sir Gawain's cries of grief increased the pressure on Arthur. Gawain had lost not only his brothers, but also all respect for Lancelot, whom he had once admired. His honor now demanded not only justice, but also vendetta, vengeance. Arthur had no choice.
The boundaries of love and friendship had been crossed, leaving only the king's merciless duty. His own heart torn, Arthur Pendragon decreed that his wife, Guinevere, be burned at the stake for adultery. In making this decision, he knew Lancelot would return to stop it, and that this would initiate the civil war that would bring the kingdom's end. The legend of King Arthur was not only a tale of idealistic knights and tragic kings, but also of magical objects that altered the very fabric of fate. Excalibur was the most brilliant symbol of this power, the sword of legitimacy and royalty. But the fate of Britain revolved around other objects as powerful as Excalibur, even more insidious or even more sacred. These objects proved that power was more than just steel. Excalibur's scabbard lost immortality. Excalibur's power lay in its sharpness. It cut iron like paper. But Arthur's true protection was not the sword itself, but the scabbard given to it by the Lady of the Lake. This simple leather scabbard, with ancient runes etched into it, prevented its wearer from bleeding. As long as Arthur carried this scabbard, even the most mortal wounds could not be sustained on the battlefield. This gave him an aura of supernatural courage and invincibility. Morgana Le Fay's, in Chapter 17, greatest strategic victory wasn't defeating Arthur in a duel, but stealing the scabbard and throwing it into a magical lake. With the scabbard lost, Arthur lost his invincible status. The king was now mortal. This was the only way Mordred could kill him in the final battle. Morgana had stolen Arthur's immortality, paving the way for her brother's death. The Round Table, the spell of equality. One of the most powerful magical objects wasn't a weapon, but a piece of furniture, the Round Table itself. Gifted to Arthur by Merlin, or, according to some legends, by Guinevere's father, this massive table was no simple piece of oak. Its roundness was a spell that shattered all previous social order. There was no head at that table, no end. Every knight who sat at that table was equal in the king's eyes. It was a spell of balance, demoting arrogant dukes and barons to the same level, destroying the hierarchy. The table itself was a physical seal of the ideal of brotherhood. The kingdom began to weaken not when the knights broke their oaths, but when they betrayed the table's spell of equality. For example, when they conspired against Lancelot. The Holy Grail, the power of purity. The Grail was not a passive relic. It was an active force. Its presence was the manifestation of the divine on earth. It could satisfy physical hunger, the feast at Camelot, and spiritual hunger. But its true power lay in its ability to act as a mirror, reflecting the soul of every knight who approached it. It cast Lancelot's sin into his face, exposed Gawain's worldly arrogance, and rewarded Galahad's purity. The Grail's power was healing. It healed not only the Fisher King's wound, but also the barren lands that lay with it. Its withdrawal from Britain meant not only a spiritual loss, but also the loss of the land and the kingdom's healing power. The Holy Spear, Longinus's spear. The Grail wasn't the only relic the knights saw during the Grail Crest. A blood-drenched spear was also carried in the procession to the Fisher King's castle. This was the Holy Spear, believed to be the spear of the Roman soldier Longinus, who pierced Jesus' side on the cross. Unlike the Grail's healing power, the spear symbolized pain, wound, and sacrifice. The Fisher King's unhealing wound was inflicted by this spear. Without the union of these two objects, the Grail and the spear, neither the king nor the land could heal. Galahad's shield, divine protection. Galahad, the chosen knight of the Grail quest, was given objects that proved he had no need for earthly weapons. The most important of these was a white shield believed to have belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. On the shield was a red cross drawn with Joseph's own blood. This shield was a shield of faith that protected Galahad not only from physical blows, but from Morgana's illusions and demonic temptations.
These objects proved that the fate of Camelot was not solely in the hands of humans. Magic, fate, and divine intervention were forces at least as real and potent as the knight's swords.
King Arthur's genius lay not only on the battlefield or in the idealistic oaths of the Round Table, but also in the way he governed the daily affairs of his kingdom. Camelot's golden age was made possible not only by the justice of knights, but also by well-stocked warehouses, safe roads, and a fair tax system. Unlike Uther and the petty kings before him, Arthur understood that a kingdom's strength was measured not only by the sword, but also by the plow. Arthur's first and most revolutionary act in government was to centralize the concept of justice. Before him, justice had been at the whim of local lords or barons. A lord could arbitrarily seize a peasant's produce or demand an exorbitant toll from a merchant. Arthur put an end to this arbitrariness. He sent the Knights of the Round Table throughout the kingdom not only to slay giants, but also as king's judges. Their duty was to resolve local disputes, ensure fair play by lords, and demonstrate that everyone, noble or peasant, was subject to the same law. This legal security fueled an economic boom. Arthur knew that agriculture was the foundation of his kingdom. After ending the Saxon threat with his victory at Badon Hill, he encouraged most of his soldiers to disband and return to their fields. Through a program he called Swords of Peace, he allocated land to veterans to cultivate. When the king's justice guaranteed that a farmer would be rewarded for his labor, more fields were planted, better agricultural techniques were developed, and the storehouses were filled with a prosperity Britain had not seen in a long time. The second step was to revitalize trade. Since the Roman withdrawal, the magnificent Roman roads that crisscrossed Britain had fallen into disrepair, overgrown with forests, and become a haven for bandits. Arthur viewed these roads as the arteries of his kingdom. One of the most important tasks he assigned to his knights was to clear, repair, and most importantly, secure these roads. Sir Kay served for a time as the commander responsible for the security of these king's roads, and with his ruthless discipline, he ensured the roads were safe for trade. Once the roads were secured, trade flourished. Camelot became not only a fortress, but also an international trading center. Tin from Cornwall, wool from Wales, and grain from the east all met at Camelot's market. Arthur introduced a fair and standardized tax system. No longer did each bridgehead pay a different tax. This predictability allowed even traders from the continent, France, and even the Mediterranean to come to Britain. The royal treasury was filled with steady income from trade and agriculture, not from plunder or conquest. His administrative structure also supported this prosperity. Rather than concentrating all power in his own hands, Arthur used the Round Table as a kind of advisory council. Economic decisions, harvests, and trade route issues were discussed at the table. Arthur mandated that each knight be responsible for his own domain and report to the king on the welfare of the people there. This was an early system of feudal control, ensuring a king was aware of the hunger or distress of his people. This system funded Camelot's magnificent festivals in Chapter 20 and the flourishing of art and culture. Prosperity strengthened the people's loyalty to the king. The people were loyal to Arthur, not only because he was a military leader, but also because he provided them with peace, justice, and a full stomach. Therefore, the kingdom's collapse would not only be a political setback, but also the end of the greatest period of prosperity Britain had ever known.
In Britain's collective memory, the word king was synonymous with fear. Kings were like storms in the sky, remote, dangerous, and unpredictable. Powerful kings like Uther Pendragon viewed the people as pawns.
leading them into war and arbitrarily seizing their lands. The people disliked their king. They feared and endured him. When Arthur Pendragon ascended to the throne, he fundamentally shattered this millennia-old perception. He was not a king the people feared, but a king they loved, trusted, and helped build. What distinguished Arthur in the eyes of the people was his background. He had not grown up as a prince in a palace. He had lived a simple life alongside Sir Ector, tending horses and serving as a squire. When the people looked at Arthur, they saw not an arrogant nobleman born in purple cloaks, but one of their own, someone placed on the throne by fate. This created a deep bond of empathy between him and the people that no king had ever established before. Arthur knew what hunger meant, what it felt like to stand guard on a cold night. His understanding of justice was born from this empathy. For Arthur, justice didn't mean complex legal texts or the privileges of nobles. Justice was simple, doing what is right. The doors of the Great Hall in Camelot were always open to the people. On certain days of the week, even the humblest peasant could come directly to King Arthur to complain about a neighbor who had stolen his field or a lord who had bullied him. This was a revolutionary change. Previously, it had been unthinkable for a peasant to complain about a lord. But before the Round Table, Arthur listened with equal seriousness to the word of a duke and the word of a farmer. If a knight, even a knight of the Round Table, abused his power and oppressed a peasant, Arthur's punishment would be swift and just. This gave the people an unwavering belief in the truthfulness of the king's justice. Laws now existed not only to punish them, but also to protect them. The people's love for him was most evident at festivals and tournaments. Arthur was not afraid to mingle with the people. At Pentecost celebrations, he would dance with them, listen to the bard's songs, and personally award the best archer a prize. He was not a ruler locked in his tower, but a leader of his people. His respect was also evident in his army. The soldiers fought for Arthur because he was at the forefront of the ranks, fighting alongside them with Excalibur in hand. He was a commander who led his men, not one who sent them to their deaths. The victory at Badon Hill was not only a testament to his military genius, but also the result of his men's unwavering devotion to him. However, this profound love and respect would make the kingdom's downfall even more tragic. The people had so idealized Arthur that they forgot that he too was a human, capable of suffering and making mistakes. When the betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere was revealed, it shook not only the court, it also shook the people's faith in justice. How would the king administer justice to his own wife and best friend? And when Mordred's rebellion began, this would be Mordred's greatest weapon. He would whisper to the people, "Arthur has abandoned you. He seeks glory in Rome while the Saxons burn your homes." Or, "Where is your king's justice? He ignores his own treachery." When the people's love for Arthur turned to disappointment, it would mean the severing of the last bond that held the kingdom together.
Camelot's tragedy began not with an external enemy tearing down the walls, but with the decay of brotherhood within. The Round Table was once Britain's greatest power, a symbol of ideals and equality. But after the height of its golden age, this symbol began to crumble and crumble under its own weight. The table was still there, but the spirit that united it had vanished. The first seeds of its decline were sown with the quest for the Holy Grail. This spiritual quest, rather than uniting the knights, divided them. The purists, Sir Galahad and Sir Percival, left the world, leaving an unfillable void at the table. Those who returned were wounded. Sir Lancelot returned, shamed by his sinful failure. Sir Gawain, angered by his failure to grasp the divine, clung even more rigidly to worldly rules of honor. The spiritual center of the table was lost, leaving only the ghosts of worldly ambitions and personal failures. This spiritual void provided the perfect backdrop for the ultimate betrayal, the poison of the forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere. This was no longer a secret whisper, but an open secret echoing through the palace halls, known to all, but dared not speak aloud. This secret divided the table by invisible lines. On one side were those loyal to Lancelot, those of his blood like his cousins, Sir Bors and Sir Ector de Maris, who would follow him no matter what. On the other were those loyal to Arthur, but disturbed by the king's apparent blindness to this betrayal. And most dangerous of all was the faction known as the Orkney faction, led by Sir Agravain and Sir Mordred, Sir Gawain's brothers. For them, this relationship was not merely an act of depravity, but a direct insult to the king and the kingdom. Distrust replaced the brotherhood at the table. Knights who would once have given their lives for each other now saw each other as rivals. The tournaments were no longer friendly displays of prowess, but veiled, dangerous duels between Lancelot's faction and the Orkney faction. As Arthur attempted to diffuse this tension, his indecision was interpreted as weakness by both sides. Internal strife became a part of court life. Knights no longer sought quests to ensure justice, but rather to curry favor with the king or defeat rivals. Sir Gawain's strict sense of honor clashed with Lancelot's blatant favoritism, Arthur's constant protection of him. Gawain could not accept that Lancelot was both the greatest hero and the greatest traitor. In this chaotic environment, Sir Mordred, chapter 25, worked like a poison. He did not create this distrust, he merely fed and manipulated it. Lancelot is making fools of us all. The king is dishonorable, the queen is faithless. We must save the honor of this table, he whispered in Agravain's ear. He asked the other knights, does Arthur only administer justice to the peasants? Why do the worst crimes go unpunished in his own hall? The weakening of the Round Table was sealed by the breaking of oaths. Brothers began to plot against each other. The oath of loyalty to the king had become loyalty to the faction. Unity was shattered. The table was no longer a brotherhood gathered for a common cause, but a broken circle of jealous, angry, and betrayed men ready to throw themselves at each other's throats at any moment. Camelot had been conquered from within, without a single sword being struck.
The civil war was ignited by the blood of 12 knights slain by Lancelot's sword at the door of Queen Guinevere's chamber. That night, Camelot's oath of brotherhood was broken forever. Lancelot fled the castle covered in blood, vowing to return to rescue the queen. King Arthur was left with the most impossible choice of his life, justice or love. But Sir Gawain's grief prevented Arthur from making a choice. Among the knights slain by Lancelot's rage were Gawain's beloved brothers, Gareth and Gaheris, who were said to be unarmed. Gawain's admiration for Lancelot instantly turned into a volcanic hatred. When he stood before the king, he was no longer the honorable nephew, but a Celtic warrior consumed by vengeance. "Justice," he roared. "My brother's blood is on the ground. The queen is guilty, and Lancelot is a traitor. If you do not uphold your law, you are not king." Arthur was trapped by his own laws and Gawain's anger. Heartbroken, he ordered Queen Guinevere burned at the stake for adultery and treason. Mordred watched all this with cold satisfaction. His plan was working perfectly. As he had predicted, on the day Guinevere was to be burned, Lancelot, along with his knights, led by his cousin Sir Bors, stormed the execution grounds. This was not a rescue operation, but an open battle. Lancelot rescued the queen from the flames, but in the chaos, he was forced to slay many more Arthurian knights who tried to stop him. The Round Table was now officially divided. Lancelot retreated to his stronghold of Joyous Gard, taking the queen with him. Civil war had begun. Driven by Gawain's relentless demands for revenge, Arthur gathered his army and laid siege to Lancelot's castle.
This siege, which lasted for months, drained the kingdom's resources. Arthur's finest knight and the King of Britain were destroyed by the love of a woman. Finally, through the intervention of the papacy, a fragile peace was forged. Lancelot returned Guinevere to Arthur. The queen would later retire to a monastery, and he himself was exiled from Britain, returning to his lands in France. But Gawain's revenge remained unabated. He convinced Arthur to follow Lancelot to France, to purge this taint for once and for all. This was the moment Mordred had been waiting for. Arthur gathered the largest army in his kingdom and prepared to cross the sea after Lancelot. He had to leave Britain behind. And in the greatest tragedy of all, he had to decide to whom he would entrust the kingdom. He appointed Mordred, whom he considered his own blood, ambitious but capable, as regent of Britain. He surrendered the crown and the kingdom's seal to his own executioner. The moment Arthur's fleet disappeared over the horizon, Mordred revealed his true colors. Until then, he had played the role of a loyal nephew, a stern defender of justice. Now he cast off that mask. His first act was to forge letters. These letters claimed that Arthur had been killed by Lancelot in battle in France. With the kingdom engulfed in grief, Mordred made his second move. He gathered the remaining lords and knights who had returned disappointed from the quest for the Holy Grail. He told them that Arthur had abandoned the kingdom for a personal vendetta, that the Saxons were gathering on the borders, and Rome demanded tribute. Britain needs a strong hand, not a dreamer seeking adventure in France. With their support, he declared himself the new High King of Britain. In the final and most horrific act of his treachery, he announced that he would marry Queen Guinevere, even though she was in a convent, to legitimize his throne. This was an attempt to seize not only the throne, but his father's entire legacy, honor, and love. Mordred was no longer the conspirator whispering in the shadows. He was an open rebel who had taken the crown, sat on the throne, and usurped Arthur's army and kingdom. Upon receiving this news in France, Arthur had no choice but to abandon his war with Lancelot and return home to face his own sons' and nephews' treachery.
Civil war had ravaged Britain. Arthur's army had waited for months before the walls of Lancelot's stronghold, Joyous Gard. The brothers of the Round Table had brandished spears and swords at each other. Worthy knights from both sides had perished at the hands of friends once sworn at the same table. The war was fueled by Gawain's unquenchable thirst for vengeance and prolonged by Arthur's grief-stricken indecision. Lancelot, however, was defending his castle against the king he loved to protect the woman he loved. It was a battle no one could win, and it was sapping the very soul of the kingdom. Finally, news reached Rome, to the Pope. It was unacceptable that the most glorious kingdom in Britain should self-destruct because of an adultery scandal. The Pope's envoys arrived at the gates of Joyous Gard with a heavy edict. The edict threatened excommunication on all sides and ordered immediate peace. This divine intervention untied the bloody knot that no one could break. A cold and tense truce was signed. The terms were a bit of a defeat for everyone. Sir Lancelot would honorably return Queen Guinevere to King Arthur. King Arthur would spare the queen's life. Sir Lancelot and all his knights, his cousins Sir Bors, Sir Ector de Maris, and others, would leave Britain and go into exile in their own lands in France, Gaul. The day of the return was the saddest day Camelot had ever known. Lancelot rode in his finest armor, flanked by his cousins. Queen Guinevere, her face veiled, walked beside him. They were met not by the king himself, but by Sir Gawain and the remaining loyal knights who waited in Arthur's camp with cold anger. Lancelot dismounted. He took Guinevere's hand one last time, but could not utter a word. There was nothing left to say. Their love had burned a kingdom. As he handed the queen over to Gawain, Lancelot's eyes searched the crowd for Arthur. He longs to see his king, his friend, one last time. But Arthur wasn't there. The king, unable to bear the face of both his best friend and his wife, was locked in his tent, mourning the collapse of his kingdom. Gawain looked at Lancelot as he accepted the queen. There was no mercy or old friendship in his eyes, only icy hatred. "Traitor! You have stained these lands. The blood of my brothers is still on your hands. Go, and pray I don't come after you." Lancelot didn't answer. He knew he deserved Gawain's wrath. He would carry the guilt of killing Gareth and Gaheris to the end of his days. The exile procession set off for the port in silence. This wasn't just Lancelot's exile. It was the defection of the Round Table's most powerful faction, half the kingdom's sword. Sir Bors, Sir Ector de Maris, and others had abandoned their homelands out of loyalty to their leader. As they boarded their ships, Lancelot took one last look at the misty shores of Britain. He had come here as nothing, raised by the Lady of the Lake, and become the greatest knight in the world. He had won the friendship of a king and the love of a queen. And now, he had lost it all. He was in exile. Through his own fault, he had lost his dearest friend, his greatest love, and the kingdom he had fought for. As his ship set sail for France, Lancelot knew he had been separated not only from Camelot, but also from a great part of his own soul.
When Lancelot's ships disappeared over the horizon, Guinevere had no refuge. She was no longer the queen, but a sinner, a traitor who had plunged the kingdom into civil war. Lancelot had fought for his love and paid the price with exile. Arthur mourned his duty with a broken heart. Gawain burned with the fire of revenge. But what of Guinevere? Her fate was the quietest yet most bitter in this world of men. The Pope's edict had saved her life. Arthur was forced to rescind the sentence of execution he had pronounced during the siege of Joyous Gard. The peace treaty stipulated that the queen's life be spared. But this was a legal pardon, not a public pardon. When Guinevere was brought back to Arthur's camp, she was greeted by neither king nor husband. She was greeted by the cold, judgmental gazes of the knights who had once worshipped her as the epitome of courtly courtesy and beauty. Her trial took place not in a courtroom, but in the corridors of the palace every day, every moment. She was no longer the Queen of Britain, she was Lancelot's woman. Gawain, mourning the loss of his brothers, never looked upon the queen's face again. The other knights turned their heads as they passed, treating the woman they had once won tourneys for like the plague. Arthur was never alone with her again. Their marriage had been completely broken that night, not by Mordred's trap, but by Lancelot's slaughter of Arthur's men to save the queen. Arthur could have forgiven him. Perhaps they could have found a way back to their love. But Lancelot had shed the blood of Gawain's brothers. This blood had driven a wedge between Arthur and Lancelot, but also between Arthur and Guinevere. Guinevere was now not only an unfaithful wife, but also the cause of the kingdom's bloodiest division. When Arthur spoke to her for the last time, he spoke as a king, not as a wife. He offered her a choice: either continue living in Camelot, a shadow devoid of power and prestige, hated by all, or withdraw from the world. Guinevere's fate was to transform from the magnificent life of a queen into the silent penitence of a nun. Love and the throne were no longer hers. She paid the price for her choice with the greatest shame the kingdom had ever known. The queen took off her crown, discarded her silk robes, and donned a humble nun's garb. She left Camelot for the last time, bound for a priory in Amesbury, or, according to some legends, Glastonbury.
No one came to see her off. The Queen, once Britain's brightest star, was stepping silently out of history, a woman whose name was tarnished. Within the abbey's high walls, Guinevere abandoned her worldly life entirely. She spent her days praying, repenting, and trying to atone for Lancelot's betrayal and her own choices. The chaos of the outside world, Arthur's departure for France, Mordred's betrayal, reached her only in distant whispers. But even Guinevere's quiet seclusion was shaken when Mordred made his final, most perverse move. After proclaiming himself king, Mordred announced that he would forcefully marry Guinevere, still technically King Arthur's wife, to legitimize his throne. When this news reached the abbey where Guinevere had taken refuge, the queen fought the final battle of her life. When Mordred's men came for her, she was no longer a passive victim. She defended the abbey, refused to surrender, and refused to succumb to Mordred's final insult. Guinevere's fate was sealed neither by Lancelot's sword nor by Arthur's crown. His end was written in a quiet monastery cell, under the weight of his own choices, in repentance and regret, far from the chaos of the world he once ruled.
King Arthur crossed the English Channel with Britain's mightiest army, the remaining knights of the Round Table, including Sir Gawain, on his obsessive and painful campaign against Lancelot. He entrusted Britain, the seal of his kingdom, and the title of regent to his most trusted and most feared relative, Mordred. This would be Arthur's final and most fatal mistake. As soon as Arthur's fleet disappeared off the coast of France, Mordred, as described in Chapter 31, sprang into action. He spread false letters claiming the king had died at sea, declared himself king, and announced his marriage to Queen Guinevere to legitimize his throne. When Guinevere heard this news in Amesbury Abbey, where she had taken refuge, the passive, penitent victim within her had died. A queen, Arthur's queen, had been born in her place. He would not succumb to Mordred's final perverse insult. He abandoned the safety of the monastery and, with a handful of remaining loyal guards, sought refuge in the symbolic heart of the kingdom, the capital city of Camelot, or in some legends, the Tower of London. Mordred might take the crown, but he could not rule the kingdom without the capital and the queen. Camelot prepared for the most ironic and bitter defense in its history. This time, the enemy was not the Saxons or giants outside the walls. The enemy was the king's own representative, the man who bore the king's blood. Their defensive preparations were desperate. The entirety of Camelot's military was in France with Arthur. Who was left behind? The forgotten members of the Round Table, deemed too old for the French campaign. The remaining loyal commanders from the house of Sir Ector, Arthur's father, and the city guard who refused to betray their king and had not yet fallen for Mordred's lies. This small force was commanded by Queen Guinevere, who, though not clad in armor, wielded her royal authority to the fullest. Camelot's massive gates were sealed, stones were piled against the walls, pitch began to boil in cauldrons, and provisions were gathered within the castle. This was not a defense of victory, but a delay, a defense to hold out until word reached Arthur. When Mordred's army reached the outskirts of Camelot, the disintegration of the kingdom became starkly apparent. Mordred had brought together all the elements that harbored resentment against Arthur. Jealous lords resentful of Lancelot's and therefore Arthur's rule, disillusioned mercenaries who had returned empty-handed from the quest for the Holy Grail, and, worst of all, Arthur's sworn enemies, the Saxon troops whom Mordred had summoned from the east of Britain with the promise of land. Arthur's ideal kingdom was now threatened by a horde united in its destruction.
The siege officially began. Mordred arrived at the walls and offered the queen one final offer. Open the gates and be my queen and my future wife. I will show you mercy. If you resist, I will not leave a single living stone in this castle. The answer came from Queen Guinevere, loud enough for all the soldiers to hear, from atop the walls. Traitor, serpent who has stolen the crown of your father and king. This castle is the rightful stronghold of King Arthur, and this queen is Arthur's queen. I would rather leap from these walls and die than marry you. At Mordred's command, the first battering ram struck Camelot's walls. Catapults began to hurl fiery cannonballs at the towers of this ideal city. Camelot was under siege. The defenders inside defended every stone with their lives, desperately waiting for the king to return from France.
In France, Arthur's army besieged Lancelot's castle, and Sir Gawaine's thirst for revenge dominated all strategy. Gawain challenged Lancelot daily to single combat, and Lancelot refused out of respect for his former king. In the midst of this pointless siege, far from his kingdom, Arthur was trapped in grief and indecision. At that moment, a battered messenger ship from Britain arrived at the camp, breaking through the storm. The news it brought shattered Arthur's world in a way far more profound than Lancelot's betrayal, Mordred's betrayal. Breathlessly, the messenger recounted how Mordred had declared himself king, usurped the crown, attempted to force a marriage with Queen Guinevere, and laid siege to Camelot, or perhaps the Tower of London where Guinevere had taken refuge. At that moment, all the numbness that had gripped Arthur was lifted. His anger at Lancelot, Gawaine's thirst for revenge, all paled in comparison to the horror of this utter betrayal of his own blood. He had left Britain to punish a friend and surrendered his kingdom to his serpent. "Prepare the ships," he roared. "We are going home." The battle with Lancelot was abandoned immediately. The siege was lifted. Arthur's army, grief-stricken but united in a single purpose, hurriedly piled onto ships to return to Britain. When Mordred received this news through his spies, he lifted the siege of Camelot. He hadn't been able to detain the queen, but now he had a bigger problem. His father's avenging army was returning. To prevent Arthur from setting foot in Britain, Mordred gathered his entire army and headed for the shores of Dover in the southeast of the island. His army consisted of traitorous lords sworn to him, mercenaries, and Arthur's sworn enemies, his Saxon allies. His strategy was simple: to catch Arthur's army on the beach, exhausted and unprepared before they had even disembarked, and to destroy them. When Arthur's fleet approached the cliffs of Dover, they were not met with a welcoming committee, but with an inferno of arrows and catapult fire. Mordred's army was positioned atop the cliffs. Arthur's soldiers had to fight their way through shallow waters, facing a rain of arrows, to disembark and reach the beach. This was not a landing, but a desperate landing. And in this chaos, the cruelest twist of fate occurred. In the forefront of the battle was Sir Gawain, whose hatred for Lancelot had now turned against Mordred. He fought furiously to avenge himself and save his king's honor. However, in this brutal battle on the beach, one of Mordred's soldiers, or, according to some legends, the reopening of an old wound from a previous duel with Lancelot, suffered a fatal blow. Arthur's loyal soldiers managed to capture the beach that day, driving back Mordred's forces. But the price of victory had been too high for Arthur. Sir Gawain lay dying in his king's arms. With his last breath, the most passionate, bravest, yet most arrogant knight of the Round Table looked at Arthur. Death had erased his anger and pride, leaving only regret. "My king, this is all my fault. My arrogance, my hatred of Lancelot has brought you to this state. Forgive Lancelot, and have mercy on me. Have mercy on me." Gawain's death extinguished the last remaining warmth in Arthur's heart. His nephew, his friend, his most loyal knight had died by his own blood. The battle lines were now set. After the defeat at Dover, Mordred gathered his army and retreated west toward Cornwall. His strategy was to draw Arthur into Britain, exhaust him, and then deploy on a chosen terrain for the final decisive battle. Arthur's strategy, however, was no longer that of a king. It was the final battle of a man who had lost everything. He had no kingdom, no queen, no finest knights left. All that remained was to clean up this betrayal and reclaim the kingdom from its usurper. He gathered his army and began pursuing Mordred westward, toward that final plain that would become known as Camlann. The fate of Britain now rested in that final, fatal showdown between father and son.
The fate of Britain would be decided on that bleak riverside plain called Camlann. Arthur had led his army west for a final showdown. Mordred awaited him on this battlefield of his choosing, along with all his treacherous allies. Saxons, rebellious Celtic lords and knights exiled and dishonored from the Round Table. All were there to wrest a last shred of Arthur's kingdom. The air was heavy and stifling, a harbinger of things to come. The night before the battle began, as Arthur lay trying to sleep in his tent, he received the legend's final tragic warning. In his dream, the ghost of his nephew, Sir Gawain, who had died in France, appeared. Gawain's face was sorrowful, and he warned Arthur, "My king, my uncle, do not fight tomorrow. If you fight tomorrow, your fate will be sealed, and you will die. I have seen the end of Britain. Wait a month. Lancelot is coming from France. He has received the news. He has forgiven you. He is on his way with his army to aid you. Just 1 month, Arthur. Do not fight." Arthur awoke drenched in sweat. He had always respected dreams and prophecies. Gawain's warning shook his fatalistic heart. Perhaps this time he could stop the inevitable wheel of fortune. Chapter 15. In the morning, Arthur, for the first time in his life, chose to avoid battle. He sent emissaries to Mordred, requesting a truce, a meeting. Mordred, surprised by his father's sudden hesitation, accepted. It would be in his best interest to withdraw his army and gain time at the negotiating table. On the muddy, neutral ground between the two armies, a truce tent was set up. Arthur and Mordred, each with 14 of their most trusted knights, sat down at the table. The negotiations progressed, though tensely. Arthur, heeding Gawain's warning, made incredible concessions to Mordred, the lands of Cornwall and Kent, even the heir to the throne after Arthur's death. Mordred seemed to have gained everything without winning the war. A peace treaty was drafted. The kingdom, though wounded and divided, would live on. But fate needed the venom of a small serpent to bring about the collapse of a kingdom. As the treaty was about to be signed, both leaders issued a stern order to their armies. "If even a single sword is unsheathed on this plain during the truce, it is treason, and war must begin immediately." In that moment of tense silence, in the tall grass near the peace table, a small viper attacked and stung the foot of one of Mordred's knights. The knight winced in pain. Instinctively, without thinking, he drew his sword to slay the snake. Sunlight reflected off the shining steel of that single sword. Both armies waited for that moment. Each side was certain the other would betray. When they saw that flash, a single voice rose, "Traitor! Traitor!" The war horns blew, drowning out any cries of peace from Arthur or Mordred. The final battle Gawain had prophesied, the one Arthur had tried to avoid, had begun with a snake bite, a foolish accident. The Battle of Camlann was not a battle of strategy. It was a massacre. This was not the heroic struggle of Badon Hill. This was the ugly, muddy end of a civil war of hatred, betrayal, and brother striking brother. Arthur fought desperately, Excalibur in hand. Mordred fought to destroy his father's legacy. Throughout the day, the last remaining heroes of the Round Table fell one by one. Men who had once drank wine at the same table, swore the same oaths, now slit each other's throats. Sir Lucan struggled to stand despite his wounds to protect Arthur. Sir Bedivere fought beside Arthur to the end. As the evening sun descended upon the blood-soaked plain,
The battlefield lay in a grim silence. Thousands of dead bodies lay there. The flower of British chivalry withered that day in that muddy field. Hope was lost. Almost no one remained of Arthur's army. The kingdom died that day at Camlann.
The evening twilight had turned the plain of Camlann into a graveyard. The stench of blood mingled with the mist on the river. Thousands of bodies lay silently amid broken swords and tattered banners. The entire Round Table and Mordred's army had perished in that day's senseless slaughter. Amidst all of this destruction, King Arthur still stood. His armor was crushed, his shield shattered. At his side stood his two last remaining loyal knights, brothers Sir Lucan and Sir Bedivere. Sir Lucan, wounded so severely that his innards were spilling out, held on by sheer force of will. Arthur rose slowly from the ranks of the dead and gazed out over the battlefield. His heart was filled with grief, not for his kingdom, but for his vanished brotherhood. It was then that he saw the lone figure standing on a pile of corpses at the other end of the plain, Mordred. He too was alive, the architect of treachery, watching his father's kingdom fall. In Arthur's eyes, grief gave way to cold, pure anger. This wasn't Gawain's blind revenge. This was the final, inevitable act of justice. At his side, Sir Bedivere understood his king's intentions. "Lord, no!" he pleaded. "Leave him alone. He is already cursed. Gawain's ghost warned you. Avoid your fate. We have seen enough death today." "You are alive, my king. It's a miracle. The war is over." Arthur turned to Bedivere, his eyes filled not with the weariness of a king, but of a father who has lost everything. "The war is not over, Bedivere," he said hoarsely. "As long as that serpent lives, Britain will never find peace. If this is my fate, so be it." With his last remaining strength, Arthur grasped not the sacred sword Excalibur he had once received from the Lady of the Lake, but the heavy spear Ron, or, in some legends, simply a war spear he had used in battle. Mordred, too, had seen his father coming towards him. He, too, waited, sword in hand. This was not a duel, but the final desperate thrust of two mortally wounded men. Arthur poured all his grief, the rage of the destruction of his entire kingdom, and all the strength he had learned from Merlin into that single spear thrust. He rushed at Mordred. Mordred saw his father approaching, raised his sword. The moment of fate had arrived. Arthur thrust his spear forward, aiming for the black heart of betrayal. The tip of the spear pierced Mordred's shield like paper, split his armor, and passed completely through Mordred's body. The force of the blow sent the spear tip out of Mordred's back, glinting in the last rays of the sun. Arthur had fulfilled the prophecy, slaying the murderer of his kingdom. But even in death, Mordred was filled with hatred. He was descended from his father's blood, and he had sworn to die with him. Roaring with the pain of the spear, he thrust himself forward with impossible force on his father's weapon. The spear's point sliced through his body, and he managed to get close enough to swing his sword at his father Arthur. In his moment of triumph at pushing the spear, Arthur had not anticipated this final, suicidal move from his son. Mordred swung his sword with all his might. The sword struck Arthur's helmet, cleaving the metal and carving a deep wound into the king's skull. Right where the protective scabbard Morgana had stolen was sorely lacking. The two men were locked in a silence that seemed to stand still. Father and son, king and traitor.
Mordred collapsed lifeless on his father's spear, his eyes still wide with hatred. Arthur let go of the spear. His hand flew to the hot blood flowing from the crack in his helmet. The world spun beneath his feet. He had received the mortal wound. He knelt on the ground. Running from the other side of the plain, Sir Lucan and Sir Bedivere lifted their king into their arms. Sir Lucan, struggling to carry his king, succumbed to the weight of the severe wounds he sustained. His internal organs were completely torn from his body, and he died at his king's feet. Arthur Pendragon lay on the plain of Camlann, mortally wounded by the betrayal of his own blood, beside the body of one of his 2 last loyal knights. Fate had been fulfilled, the final reckoning over. Both sides were dead.
The plain of Camlann was shrouded in the silence of the dead. Sir Lucan had perished at his king's feet. King Arthur lay limp on the muddy ground, weakened by the blood from the mortal head wound inflicted by Mordred. Beside him stood one man, the faithful Sir Bedivere. Tears welling up in his eyes, his heart torn, he held his king. Arthur struggled to breathe. His eyes were no longer fixed on the bloody reality of this world, but on a place beyond the mists. "Bedivere," he whispered, his voice raspy. "My life is ending. My task is done." He raised his head and looked at the sword at his waist, Excalibur. Despite the brutality of the battle, the sword remained spotless and bright. The jewels on its hilt glittered even in the dusk. "Take it," Arthur said, holding the sword out to Bedivere with the last of his strength. "My rightful sword. You must return it to where it came from." "Where, sir?" asked Bedivere, through tears. "To the lake," said Arthur. "Go to that black lake at the end of the plain, and throw the sword into the very center of the waters. What you see, come and tell me." Bedivere was crushed under the weight of this command. To throw the king's sword, the symbol of Britain, into a lake! It felt like murder. He didn't want to let the king go, but he obeyed. He picked up the sword and stumbled to the lake's edge. He gazed at its beauty. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was this golden age itself. What a loss, what a sin, to throw such treasure into the waters. He hid the sword in the hollow of a willow tree and returned to his king. "What did you see, Bedivere?" asked Arthur, his eyes still closed. "Lord," Bedivere lied, "I saw only the wind-tossed waters and the waves crashing upon the shore." Arthur's eyes widened in pain. "You lie to me," he whispered. "My knight, how can you covet such a sword? Go, do as I say. My fate depends on it." Bedivere turned away in shame. He seized the sword and raised his arm to throw it, but he couldn't again. He hit it again and turned to his king. He uttered the same lie. This time Arthur groaned in anger. "Traitor, you have betrayed me twice. Now go, one last time. If you disobey my command this time, I will curse you with my dying breath." Bedivere, horrified by what he had done, ran back to the lake. This time he didn't hesitate. He closed his eyes, grasped Excalibur with all his might, and hurled it into the dark waters of the lake. The sword spun in the air, shimmered, and began to plummet toward the water. But before they could hit the water, the surface of the lake broke, and a white, silk-draped woman's arm rose from the water. It was the arm of the Lady of the Lake.
She gently grasped the sword by the hilt, waved 3 times in the air as if to affirm the restoration of legitimacy, power, and magic, and then slowly, with the sword, was drawn beneath the waters. Bedivere had witnessed the miracle. He ran back to Arthur and recounted everything he had seen. Arthur smiled with relief, as if he were expiring his last breath. "Good. The time has come. Magic has returned to where it came from. The fate of Britain now lies in the hands of mortals. Now, carry me, Bedivere. Hurry." Bedivere embraced his dying king and with one last effort carried him to the lake shore. Just as they reached the shore, a strange black draped barge approached, silently gliding through the mists. 3 veiled queens stood on the boat. Some say that one of them, by a bitter twist of fate, was Morgana Le Fay herself, now acting as a healer and seer. The queens mourned when they saw Arthur. "Ah, my dear brother, why have you waited so long? Your wound has gone too deep." They gently took Arthur from Bedivere's arms and laid him on a bed in the middle of the boat. Bedivere knelt on the shore, watching his king go. "Lord," he cried in despair, "you are leaving me. What will you do without me? And what will we do without you?" With all his strength, Arthur raised his head. The boat began to move slowly into the mists toward Avalon. "Bedivere," he said, his voice no longer of this world, "the old order changes, giving way to a new. God's ways are various. Pray for me." "But will you return, Lord?" Bedivere cried. Arthur's final words echoed through the mists, not as an answer, but as a prophecy, a symbol of hope. "I go to the Isle of Avalon to heal my wounds, but this is not the end. When Britain needs me most, I will return." The boat vanished into the mists. King Arthur had departed the mortal world, transformed into legend itself. He was no longer just a king, but Rex Quondam Rexque Futurus, the once and future king.
When King Arthur vanished into the mists of Avalon, Britain lost not only its king, but also its soul. The Battle of Camlann had swallowed the finest men of a generation, the entire Round Table, and all those who opposed him in that muddy plain. No king remained to rule, no knights to administer justice, no symbol of hope for the people. Camelot's fall came not with the roar of catapults crumbling the walls, but with the deafening silence that came as the last hope was silenced. Sir Bedivere, who survived the battle, sat alone by the lake for days after his king's departure. He had lost not only his master, but the meaning of his entire life. As the last knight of the Round Table, there was no Camelot to return to, no table to swear oaths. Finally, in grief, he withdrew from the world and took refuge in a monastery. He would spend the rest of his life praying daily for his king's soul. When the people received news of the king's death or disappearance, it was not mourning, but a wave of panic. The magnificent system of justice and welfare established by Arthur, chapter 28, rested entirely on his personal authority and the power of the Round Table. When that authority vanished, the system collapsed overnight. The survivors of Mordred's army, or petty, cruel lords who had never participated in the war, immediately mobilized to fill this power vacuum. The lawless days had returned. Justice had once again fallen into the hands of the mightiest sword. The safe roads Arthur had protected fell once again to bands of bandits and plunderers. Farmers abandoned their fields and fled for the hills for their lives, for there were no knights to protect their crops.
The kingdom's external enemies watched this collapse with celebration. The Saxons, knowing their pact with Mordred was now void, began to flood from the eastern shores into the heart of Britain. This time, there was no Arthur or united Celtic army to stop them at Badon Hill. The lands were lost one by one. Arthur's dream of a united Britain was replaced once again by a series of small, warring kingdoms paying tribute to the Saxons. And what became of Camelot itself? That ideal city, those shining towers? It was no longer a capital. There was no king, no queen, no knights within. The remaining servants and common people, fearful of the impending chaos and the Saxon threat, abandoned the castle. The doors stood wide open. The looters entered and plundered the great hall, the sacred chamber where the Round Table stood. Golden cups, silks, and precious works of art were stolen. The Round Table itself, that symbol of equality, was torn apart by the looters, perhaps used as firewood to keep warm in the cold of winter. Camelot soon transformed from a beacon of hope into a magnificent ghost castle, the mossy ruin of a lost dream. News reached monasteries across Britain. In Amesbury, Guinevere heard the news of her king and Mordred's deaths and the fall of Camelot. Her remorse was no longer simply one of personal sin, but of the pain of the great destruction she had caused. Knowing she would never be forgiven, she spent her final days in silent penitence. In France, Sir Lancelot had a vision the same day Gawain's ghost appeared in Arthur's dream. He sensed Arthur's betrayal and his need for him. He gathered his army and sailed for Britain. But it was too late. When he reached the shore, he was greeted by Gawain's tomb and the bloody news of Camlann. He had been unable to help his king. The final mistake of his life was the most fatal. Overwhelmed with grief, Lancelot laid down his sword, cast off his armor, and, like Bedivere, became a monk. When he heard that Guinevere, the love of his life, had died, he too stopped eating and drinking and soon died of grief. The ideal kingdom had collapsed. All that remained were pain, loss, and the fading memory of that once bright dream called Camelot.
Camelot's towers fell into ruin. The Round Table became firewood. The king disappeared into the mists of Avalon, and the last knights died penitently in the silence of the monasteries. Britain was plunged into a dark age under the Saxon invasion. From a secular perspective, Arthur's kingdom ended in utter failure, a tragedy. But the power of legends is measured not by their actuality, but by what they represent. Camelot's physical collapse was only the beginning of its immortality as an idea. So, who was Arthur? Amidst the mists of history, a silhouette of a man does indeed stand. He is believed to have been a Romano-British warlord, Dux Bellorum, who led the Celtic resistance against the invading Saxons during the chaotic Dark Age following the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the 5th or 6th century. He was probably not a king. He didn't wear shining armor or live in a fortress like Camelot. He was one of the last Romans to combine Roman discipline with Celtic courage, taking his enemies by surprise with his cavalry, a revolutionary tactic for the time, and winning impossible victories at places like the Mount Dayton. But the legacy of legend doesn't lie in the bones of this historical figure. His legacy lies in the symbols that poets, writers, and visionaries have imbued upon this simple warlord over the centuries. Writers like Nennius, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Chrétien de Troyes, and Sir Thomas Malory took that simple soldier and transformed him into an ideal. Symbols of legend. King Arthur. He is not just a king, but the symbol of the ideal leader.
He is a just, merciful leader who derives his power not from brute force, like Uther, but from a divine destiny, Excalibur. A leader who sacrifices himself for his people. As the once and future king, Rex Quandam Rexque Futurus, he is the immortal symbol of the idea that justice and hope can return even in the darkest of times. The Round Table. This is the most radical and enduring symbol of the legend. It is the rejection of hierarchy. It is the idea that merit, honor, and courage, not wealth, bloodline, or rank, are what matter. The Round Table is a utopia of brotherhood and equality. Excalibur and the Holy Grail are the two faces of power. Excalibur represents the legitimate power that ensures earthly justice. The Holy Grail symbolizes the unattainable spiritual power, purity, and the struggle of man with his own soul. Lancelot, Guinevere, and Mordred are symbols of why this ideal collapsed. The legend tells us that Camelot was not destroyed by an external dragon or Saxon army. Camelot is destroyed from within by the most human of emotions: uncontrollable love, Lancelot and Guinevere, blind revenge, Gawain, and hatred born of his father's sin, Mordred. Impact on the present. The legend of King Arthur has survived for over 1,000 years because these symbols remain relevant. In the 21st century, we still grapple with the problems Arthur sought to solve. We still seek just and unifying leaders, Arthur. We still dream of a society where everyone is equal regardless of race, class, or creed, the Round Table. We are still torn between our ideals and our personal desires, Lancelot's dilemma. The word Camelot has become a political term, like John F. Kennedy's presidency, used to describe any period of great promise, brilliance, and idealism, but tragically short-lived. Arthur's legacy is not a historical reality, but a collective desire. He is a dream of what humanity's best could be. This dream was possible, that it was achieved, if only for a moment, and how fragile it was. The answer to the question of who King Arthur was is that he was a Celtic warrior, but the legacy of his legend is the hope within us all to build a better world. The sword was drawn into the lake, and the king into the mists of Avalon. While the legend ends here, the dream of that ideal kingdom never ends. May your nights be filled with the peace of a world awaiting the day when the once and future king will return with justice. Sleep tight.